The first lecture was sort of an overview of primarily Chinese discourse on Taiwan, specifically. The second lecture was an overview of how these kinds of hierarchies of difference are constructed in broader Chinese discourse. And this lecture is what I call a deep dive into the work of a single texting thinker. And here I feel on much more confident ground because as a political theorist, this is what we sort of do as a matter of course. This very text focus, a deep analysis of a single text and a single thinker. And the text I think we're going to be examining is Chen and his Dongfan Zi, which I'm calling Record of Formosa. So what's interesting is that not that they're representative of everything really, but that they're anomalous actually from many comparative perspectives. Compared to texts produced by other Chinese literati, both before and after, on Taiwan and other frontiers, but also compared to his European contemporaries, such as John Locke and his Hobbes. And we'll be speaking a bit about Montaigne and his work on Anna. So these were all, if you think about it, they were near contemporaries to Chen Di. He was writing in 1602. If we think about the world at that time, he was actually taught, he was an early modern, this was what we call an early modern. One of the reasons I got interested in this text is because Emma Dang and others, including Lawrence Thompson and a Chinese scholar named Jiang, see this text as a classic self-serving representation in which indigenous society is presented as simple and rustic in comparison to corrupt civilization. And in fact, they even translate the title, which I have here in the Chinese characters, as Record of Eastern Savages. Dong Fan Zi. So the Dong is east, Fan is savage, Ji is the record. But I'm going to explain a bit further along. With the Dong Fan, the title actually refers to a place. This is how the island of Taiwan is referred to in the main histories, as well as by Chen Di and other of his works. It's unequivocally a name of a place. Grammatically, it has to have that function. It's not pointing to the people of Taiwan. So my argument against this reigning scholarship on this work is that Chen offers actually a pretty objective and detailed account of a society which we otherwise know only from Dutch East India Company records. And he elaborates an irreducibly original and I say anti-imperial argument. You might recall that in the original write-up for this lecture, I think the subtitle of this is Chen Di's Record of Formosa, like a Chinese anti-imperial text from comparative perspective.
Yes.
But this text, this essay is actually under review at the Historical Journal. And they got the reviews in a week or so ago. And the reviewers were very unhappy with my calling this text anti-imperial because it was not explicitly entered into a kind of imperial discourse. It was just the record of a traveler who had no intention of talking about Taiwan in an imperial or anti-imperial way. I'm kind of taking that criticism on board, but you'll see in this lecture, I changed the subtitle at least, but I think in the broader project there's a reason for calling it anti-imperial, but for right now I'm going to sort of set that there as something for you to think about if I can actually legitimately call what he's about to do, what I'm about to describe what he's doing is anti-imperial. But it's a perspective at odds, certainly at odds with the nature and intellectual currents of his time and later. So right now I'm just calling it an alternative Chinese imaginary, which I don't know is all I could either. If you have other suggestions, let me know. But originally I sort of said it was anti-imperial for two reasons. One is because its presentation of otherness is such that it makes it nearly impossible to imagine the transformation of that other in a way more similar to oneself. So I'm arguing that the way in which he talks about the Taiwan indigenous peoples makes it impossible for him to colonize them, to imagine the possibility of bringing them into line with his own vision of the world. And also in comparison to similar claims about indigenous peoples made by near contemporary Europeans, such as Michel Montaigne, the presentation of otherness in this text I'm about to analyze is actually not used as a mirror for the self-reflexive critique of the barbarity of one's own society. If any of you are familiar with Montaigne's essay of cannibals, he's not really that interested in what cannibals do, or in specifically what the indigenous peoples of the New World are actually up to. He's more interested in sort of saying, using them as a motif against which he can compare European society for its corruption and barbarity. It turns out that in Chen Di's case, his presentation of others is actually, it rests on a certain kind of use of the past Specifically, I mean, he presents the indigenous peoples in history, enabling him to see their otherness as parallel to rather than behind that at the center of Chinese civilization. So in many kinds of accounts of indigenous people, we sometimes even call these people primitive in the sense that they're somehow behind us in time. What Chendi ends up doing is actually situating them on their own historical timeline. So I actually find that it's quite ingenious the way in which he imagines how they might live in a parallel but equally legitimate way. And based on what I've been saying in the last 2 lectures, you probably are aware that I'm quite interested in how a Chinese thinker might articulate otherness or difference as legitimate rather than deviant. We've spoken at length about that, especially in relation to something like Wyoming wrenches. So here I think we have an alternative. So building on a broader understanding of Chen's intellectual biography and his excellent works that has usually been explored, I argue that Chen reads the perceived cultural differences of the indigenous peoples of Taiwan with an imperial center as evidence of the fragility and reversibility rather than inevitable superiority of a specific certain historical story that produces the outcome of civilization. He rejects the historical timeline that confines indigenous people to some primitive stage of human development, but he also goes further to suggest that they might be understood as forging their own contingent history that exists parallel to rather than behind that of the civilizational cycle. So by placing them on a different timeline altogether, his historical narrative resists the colonial temptation to align them with Han Chinese forms of development. That's the argument. Within the global intellectual history of colonial and imperial rule, Chen thus offers a dual contribution. First, he offers a Chinese ideology of otherness that stands in sharp contrast to the Xinxue and Leixue Neo-Confucianism that dominated the Ming and Qing dynasty discourse about frontier governance. And for our purposes, he would represent the 4th line on our taxonomy here. Second, he stands as an instructive outlier for how the difference of native peoples might be recognized historically, yet without placing them behind civilization in a way that would justify the extension of rule over them. He offers a rare elaboration of an anti-imperial argument, or at least an alternative imaginary of otherness, amid predominantly Sino-centric discourses that reduce cultural difference to barbarity or historical backwardness. So Chen visited the island of Taiwan at the age of 62 as a military advisor to General Chen. So this is why I actually started the lecture with a picture of a ship. So it is from a compendium of vessels, illustrated vessels, and this does say Taiwan ship. Whether or not this is actually sailed over to Taiwan, I don't claim to know, but it might be something like this. Shen Yurong was tasked with ending the raids of pirates on the South China coast by targeting their hideouts of their lairs in Formosa. The record of Formosa, the text I'm about to present, was occasioned by a meeting with Aboriginal chieftains who presented gifts to Chen and his men out of gratitude for ridding the island of pirates. It is a short text of less than 1,500 characters. It's attached to a larger compendium of essays and poems dedicated to General Chen, called Words of Praise from the Taiwan Sea, Minhai Zhengyan. The record begins by noting the ancient and unknown origins of the island's inhabitants, whom Chen refers to as the barbarians of Dongfang, or more frequently and later as the naked and girdled people, who have neither calendars nor officials nor chiefs. So it's interesting, actually, although he refers to them as barbarians, using the word "e" once, he more typically refers to them using the word "min," like "renmin" or "min," meaning people. Which is weird. I mean, from what I've talked to Ming specialists about this, and they confirm that it is an unusual use. Chen observes that the people in the island are of diverse kinds, Zhonglei, Shen, Fan, and he wonders at how physically fit the indigenes are. Oddly enough, like Dutch commentators 2 decades later, he would also compare their running speeds to that of a horse. So these people must have been in incredibly good shape. Both Chinese and Dutch observers are noting how quickly they run and how strong they are. He notes that they live in villages of up to 1,000 people, broadly distributed along the coast. When villagers quarrel with each other, they engage in fervent battle and take heads. But the following day, he says, they quickly normalize relations. Despite the fact that headhunting was identified by Chinese authors with barbarity and foreignness since at least the Tang Dynasty, Chen notably does not dwell on these facts, nor does he use them to describe some kind of unusual penchant for violence to the islanders. He notes that the nature of the Aboriginals, their shape, is to be brave and enjoy fighting. But the bulk of his account is taken up with the details of Aboriginal social custom, architecture, agriculture, and cuisine. He's particularly interested in marriage and funeral customs, which would have posed a considerable contrast with those of his own society. It is, for example, the son-in-law who is welcomed into the bride's family, rather than vice versa, and it is the prospective bride who remains in charge of when and for how long to pursue the courtship. The women are sturdy. I should note, in the next lecture, we're going to talk about George Candidius's account of the inhabitants, where he gives much more detail about the life in these villages. And what the women do are actually it's quite interesting, including forced abortion before they're about 35. So they have these abortion procedures, allowing women basically to sleep with whoever they want until they decide to settle down with men around age 40. It's an interesting society, even to us, I think. He doesn't mention much about this, though. He does say the women are sturdy and active and do most of the agricultural work. He offers extensive details about what and how they grow food and raise domestic animals, as well as how the men conduct a collective deer hunts which bring the village meat. When someone dies, they expose the corpse to dry in the house. Only when their house becomes dilapidated do they dig a pit underneath and bury the corpse in a standing position. This is his words, but with no mount to cover it. And the house is then again raised over it. If the house is not rebuilt, the corpse is not buried. You may know, the Chinese funeral practice will mandate the use of a coffin and specific kinds of burial procedures. So this is indeed quite unusual for this time. At the conclusion of his record, he notes the Aboriginal ability to live together, where men and women freely exchange social status and positions without becoming licentious. He notes also their lack of writing or a calendar. He summarizes his findings by ruminating on the differences of Formosa. Now, this is a passage that's fairly important. We're going to come back to it again later in the lecture. I thought it might be interesting here. There's a lot more text on these slides, so you can see the Chinese. If I've made a mistake in my translation, of course, I should mention this. It also helps you understand, in fact, how this passage in particular is mistranslated by other commentators, including the Lawrence Thompson translation I gave you. That's the only English language translation that I know of, the full English translation of Chen's work. So there's actually a lot of interpolations in the text, which we can talk about in our seminar. Let's examine this passage. So he says, Mr. Unofficial Historian, by which he means himself, Mr. Chen himself. He says, how different is Formosa? From Leigh and other inlands on a boat catching the northern wind, it would take a day and night to reach the pescadores. And one more day and night, one would reach Jialaula. It is close, yet it has naked and girdled people who have neither calendars nor officials nor chiefs. Are they not also different? Moreover, they live on the sea but do not fish. They live mixed up together, yet are not licentious. Men and women exchange places, live and are buried in the same place. The whole year they hunt deer, and the deer are not depleted. Taking all of the island together, they would amount in population to one Chinese county, living with and being cared for by each other. Until this day, they are totally without calendars or writing. How different this is. Now, most discussions of Chen's record in Chinese and English language commentaries, as well as the only, as I mentioned, existing foreign English translation we have by Lawrence Thompson, construe the Dongfan that appears in this passage and in the title of the work as meaning Eastern savages, and E, which I'm translating here as difference, as meaning strangeness. So this is highlighted in the red text on the slide. These translations impart a strong flavor of cultural chauvinism to Chen's work. They diminish his ambitions to be offering an objective account of his trip to the island, and they make it easier to claim, as Emma Dunn in fact does, that Chen associates the Taiwan indigenes with the Eastern barbarians of Japan and Korea. However, all 5 references to the term Dongfan remain standard histories, as well as in Chen's other related work, including this essay called Zhou Kuwen, which I translated as Guests Ask Question of the Sailor. It's basically a Q&A session he has with the residents of Jilin when they moor there after their successful expedition. So, and all of the diary entries of the trip recorded in his biography, all of these use Dongfan as the name of the island itself. In addition to this well-established historical usage as the name of a place, which we should incidentally note really implies nothing about the inhabitants or their barbarity. The grammar of this passage, as well as Chen's subsequent comments, suggests he is not marveling at the strangeness of the barbarians, as Dunn's and Thompson's translations and interpretations would have it, so much as asking about how the Formosan islanders came to be different. He says, quote, the Japanese of the south and the Manchus of the north all have writing, like the ancient Yuan or the bird script of ancient China. Presumably at the beginning there was a wise man who invented it, but only he is without it. Why? Yet, eating to fullness and roaming freely, contented and harmonious, this is the line, the lines taken from the 12 of Imagery. What need have they for a great man? They are the people, the Wuhai and the Tian. So the Wuhai and the Tian are ancient mythical emperors. These comments at the close of his record have led various commentators to align Chen with a cynocentric imperialist gaze. In looking for the presence of a great sage who is presumed to create the basic tools of civilization, Chen does reveal his own expectations about the typical histories of human society. His description of the Aborigines as the people of the Wuhai and the Tian, moreover, seems to place them within an era of virtuous rule beyond time. Indeed, Chen worries that the honest life of the Formosan islanders will soon end under threat from Chinese traders who cheat them with shoddy products. And by increasing their awareness, their like drill, threaten their simple days. His remarks here do bear interrogating. His description of the Aboriginal people in the closing lines of the record is simple and susceptible to a growing sense of awareness due to contact with Chinese traders actually contradicts one of the only other contemporary Chinese accounts of Aboriginal life in Formosa, Zhang Xie's investigation of the Eastern and Western Oceans, Dongxi Yangkao, which was published alongside Chen's contribution in the Words of Praise Compendium. It discusses this, in particular, discusses trading practices of indigenous people in Taiwan and Dutch trade. It was not based on a first-hand account. These were stories that Zhang Xie collected from sailors and merchants that were coming through Fujian. He lived near a port that turned out it was one of the largest ports in the Ming Dynasty, and it did a lot of trade as it happened with northern Taiwan. So it was not a first-hand account, but in this account, Zhang Xie does tell us that the indigenous people in Taiwan and Dutch trade in fact, were quite shrewd, very good at trading. They often conducted, I suppose, like big gatherings of themselves along with, and they would invite foreigners like the Dutch or Chinese to go and trade with them and eat with them and share a meal. So the kind of picture that emerges from his account is a bit different from what we see here. So I say more about this elsewhere, but I note here that Xia's observations about the canniness and shrewdness of the indigenous traders strengthens views such as those of Emma, who argues that Chen's record does not present an accurate representation of indigenous life, but rather repeatedly alludes to a passage of the Taoism, which a canonical text associated with Taoism, you guys know it already, right? That describes a golden age of simplicity. Sort of like the peach blossom spring. This is a depiction, this is a contemporary Ming depiction of peach blossom spring, which is sort of a Taoist utopia from the 5th century. But Emma contends that when Chen traveled to Taiwan and saw the native simplicity, he really had something like this in mind. She quotes the Lao Tzu, this ancient text, to show what she claims are parallels between Chen's description of the indigenous people and Lao Tzu's text. So Lao Tzu says, in the Tao Te Ching, it says, "Let them take death seriously and desist from distant campaigns. Even if they have boats and wagons, they will not travel in them. Even though they have weapons and armor, they will not form ranks with them. Let people revert to the practice of brother time." It's from the Tao Te Ching. Deng argues that the above passage, along with the Taoist-inspired utopia of Tao Yuan Ming's 5th century fable Peach Blossom Spring, was the source of the primitivist, she calls them primitivist tropes that she identifies in Chen's record of Formosa. Given the pervasiveness of such tropes in writing about non-Chinese peoples, she concludes that narratives employing them, quote, might have more to do with the traveler's dissatisfaction with Chinese society than with his actual perceptions of indigenous society. As will be discussed at greater length below, however, Chen does draw heavily on Taoist tropes, but these influences and the rumination about civilization that they inspire give voice to more than just anxiety over the moral decline of Chen's own society. A closer look at the record of Chen's own biography suggests that such tropes of simplicity motivate Chen to think more clearly about the diversity of human pasts. And in order to see why this is the case, we have to examine more closely the context and purpose of the metaphors that Chen uses to describe the indigenous peoples. So we might start by grasping this more complex picture by noting that actually what the account that I gave earlier of Chen's record doesn't in any way, in my view, match up with the quote from the Lao Tzu that Emma Dunn claims to be constitutive of Chen's thinking on the subject. So Chen does not claim, as Dunn argues he does, that Taiwan is small and the village is isolated, or that he followed the Tao Te Ching so closely so as to pretend the Aboriginals never came into contact with each other or formed ranks for fighting. In fact, as we have seen, Chen noted frequent intervillage head hunting, and he observed that the heads of enemies were displayed where they were. discourse. So, I mean, this is hardly somebody who's rejecting the place of violence in a simple society. Rather, textual allusions in the record and Chen's own biography indicate a stronger affinity not to the Tao Te Ching, but to the Zhuangzi. In poems written after his son's death, Chen likens himself to Zhuangzi explicitly, and his close friend and reading partner, who's the famous Ming literatist Jiao, wrote a canonical commentary of Zhuangzi, and it turned out that Chen and Jiao had a very close relationship. They would often share books. And he would go, I guess he'd like Chen to leave his family and go study with Jiao for months at a time. I guess he just wasn't happy with family life or whatever, but he would stay with Jiao and they would talk about books and ideas for months at a time, and then he'd sort of go back to, make sure his family's okay, and then he'd go back to talk to Jiao. So I mean, he was very, very, very familiar with Zhuangzi, the canonical, as a canonical text, but also the commentary that Jiao actually produced on the Zhuangzi. So we know that it was a big influence in his life. Such influences, I think, align Chen with a different set of Taoist techniques. Not those which celebrate primitive society, but rather those which set forth conventional boundaries between self and other, by extension, tropes of civilization and enlightenment, as a means of exposing their arbitrary value and contingency. One of the most significant examples of this approach lies in Chen's vivid description of Aboriginal cuisine, a passage significantly left out of many appropriations of the record by later Chinese authors, and wholly overlooked by modern-day commentators who align Chen with Han Chinese and Creole raiders. You haven't just eaten breakfast, have you? You don't have weak sides. He says, the inhabitants are customarily very fond of deer. They lay open the intestines and the recently swallowed grass, both that which has been turned to feces and that which is not yet turned to feces. They call 100 grasses paste, a delicacy they cannot get enough of. When Chinese see it, they immediately vomit. It's it. Apparently, this was a practice also among the Aztecs. By eating digested and almost digested intestinal contents, they had some kind of like biological, like for our gut biome, we had some kind of bacteria that would help human digestion. So apparently this is
like sauerkraut.
Yeah, like sauerkraut, exactly. It's like a kind of partial fermentation that actually helps aid human digestion. But anyway, when Chinese see it, maybe us, they immediately vomit. Now the Aborigines eat pig, but do not eat chicken. When they see Chinese eating chicken or pheasant, they vomit. So who knows what the correct taste is? And how can there be similarities when people have a life? Now, what we eat and what kind of tastes we have, what kind of cuisine we eat, I don't think in contemporary times is usually considered something that's terribly political, but I'm going to argue for Chen it is terribly political. It has a very deep kind of countercultural radical meaning. This passage demonstrates several ways in which Chen attempts to render Aboriginal difference on his own terms, while advancing a reflection on the stability of his own familiar civilizational conventions. Chen's observations recall those of Montaigne, here we have our discussion of Montaigne, who used the eating habits of New World peoples as a mirror for criticizing European barbarity. I'll get this unsettling passage on your site now, just focus on him. In his famous essay of Cannibals, he argues that his European readers have much to learn from these flesh eaters, whose simple living and apparent lack of government reveal their proximity to an original naturalness and impurity akin to the Platonic Golden Age. I think it was Dennis yesterday that mentioned Rousseau, talking about Rousseau has a view about primitive people or about native simplicity. And it was a very, very, very widespread trope for many centuries in Europe. Montaigne was also one of the people that exploited it, this idea, especially with the discovery of the New World. This is one of the reasons why it became so popular. Is that you have this example, they thought, of a kind of pre-political simplicity of giving a snapshot of what human beings look like closer to their origins. So maybe by looking at that, you would have some idea of how we should be acting, how we should be organizing our societies. So Montaigne's text drew on and perpetuated this myth, the myth of the noble savage, right? In 16th century Europe, it would go on to have a much longer life than that. But by using a fanciful representation of Amerindians to demonstrate that human life could be free from the artifice of social practices and institutions that distorted contemporary society, perpetuated inequality, and naturalized political power. So this is what this is what Montaigne is actually using the indigenous peoples of the New World for. There's not a whole lot of description or detail in his account other than to say they're flesh eaters, but they live simply. But for Chen, similar observations about the simplicity and eating habits of the Formosans are directed to a very different kind of intellectual context. Chen used his encounter with indigenous society, not so much to engage in a critique of his own society, or to advance the cause of reason by adopting indigenous peoples as exemplars of internal purity, as Montaigne did. Rather more like the classical Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi, he interrogated the grounds of what in his time were taken to be established truths about human nature. Now, although food and taste may not seem terribly relevant as markers of difference, certain forms of Confucianism, as we've seen already, did hold that there existed particular flavors that would appeal to suitably cultivated individuals. The idea that people could exhibit objectively correct preferences for such things as tastes infuses later colonial writing on Taiwan, whose authors for the most part assumed that developing a preference for Chinese cuisine and other cultural practices was a necessary rather than contingent feature of the human condition. You know, it's funny thinking about food in relation to China and intercultural, discussions. It reminds me of when I was reading for my first two big projects when I went into the 20th century. And although, people like Deng Xiaoping and Tong, these were very hardcore, in some cases, hardcore westernizers. The one thing they never said they wanted to adopt was European food, because they, in every case, insisted that Chinese food was just superior, like objectively. You have these random references. They'll say, "Oh yes, we love the West. We want to do everything. We love liberty, everything." But the food is not so great, except for maybe French food. But everything else is like the kind of food adopted. So now that I'm reading this in practice, I'm thinking back and wondering about how the stakes of difference in terms of cuisine and food, and what that means to people. He says, our mouths all share the same taste when it comes to flavor, our ears all share similar pleasures in listening when it comes to sound, our eyes all share similar standards of beauty when it comes to looks. How could it be that our hearts alone are different? What quality do we share in our hearts? It is the sense of what is proper and right. We've heard this before. The sage is merely the one who is first to grasp what our hearts all take pleasure in. And in this way, what is proper and right pleases my heart, and just the way that meats please my mouth. In later passages, like this, that was 6A7. This is actually an edition that's found in the British Library. I just happened to find it online. I thought it would be interesting to see it here. But in later passages, 3A4, Mencius lays out the founding story in which sages appeared to clarify these tastes and these pleasures for us. So it wasn't just like what we eat, but also what we take pleasure in. Houzi taught us how to plant grain, Ping Yao taught us about proper human relationships, etc. Predictably, when later Chinese writers defend the humanity of the Aboriginals, they do so on the basis of their capacity to receive and use such sagely teaching. So this is explicitly the basis of Yu Yonghe's defense of Aboriginal humanity. They say that they have a human shape, but he insists that they be bathed in the teaching of the sage gaze as a means of developing their inward natures. So if we briefly revisit Yu Yonghe's arguments here, we're not going to repeat, but I just sort of refresh our memory. Will help us see other parts of his account that we sort of glossed over yesterday. But I think in seeing Yu Yonghe in comparison with Chen Di helps us understand that Chen Di's refusal to uphold great men, these great founders, as necessary and sufficient for establishing content societies, undermines the broader Confucian narratives in which such founders appear. So we know that Yu traveled to Taiwan in 1697, so he traveled about 100 years later than Chen Di. He stayed for 10 months. So Chen Di stayed for about 10 days, Yu Yonghe stayed for 10 months. And Yu Yonghe was there to assist Qing officials in locating and mining new sources of sulfur, mainly in the northern part of the island. So Chen Di was in the southwestern coast, and Yu Yonghe was in the northern part. So it's important to remember that although Chen was one of the first Han Chinese to arrive on Taiwan shores, probably not the first, because I don't know if it's occurred to any of you, how did we understand the original chieftains that he met? Where was the base to come from? There were already Chinese translators living among the indigenous people. These were fishermen and merchants, so he wasn't the first Han Chinese to visit the island, but he was certainly the first Han Chinese literate elite, right? So Yu Yonghe, in contrast, was writing for a Qing administration anxious about taking on the troublesome and rebellion-ridden island. But we know that Yu Yonghe notes with optimism that Aborigines can be transformed by culture and rights, be acculturated to the poetry and the documents. He says this will take 30 to 100 years. And it's at this point in Yu Yonghe's account Oddly enough, he says, by guiding them with the teaching of ritual, how will they be any different from the people of the central stage? Zhongguo Jimmy. So it's at this point, once the indigenous people have achieved a certain measure of Chineseness, they've become sinified to a certain extent. At that point in his narrative, he starts referring to them as being as people. Right? But recall that Chendi started he used the word being from the very beginning, mostly to describe these indigenous people. Now, Yu Yonghe, of course, links this development of shame to the specific institutions of Chinese civilization, including the tea prayer. And he recalls here a long line of origin stories. We looked at one of them in lecture 2 yesterday about Han Yu and his essay Yuan Dao, Origins of the Dao. And it followed mentions, I don't know if you remember this or if you noted it, but we talked about the kinds of brains that you eat, the kinds of food that you eat as a proper Chinese individual, right? So he explicitly follows mentions to link culinary preferences with the teaching of the ancient sages. So what I'm asking you to observe here is not only how our shame is developed, that was the theme of the first two lectures, the fact that we have a human shame that has to be developed in specific ways. I'm also drawing attention to the fact that one of those ways is perhaps an unanticipated engagement with cuisine, with how we eat, and the kinds of society we then, not just the kinds of society, but also the kinds of desires that we then cultivate. And that these are linked to the teaching of the former kings. There's an explicit and repeated mention of the fact that they were great men who taught us these things. And we honor them by repeating their teaching and by fulfilling what they tell us to do. Right? So they tell us to eat grains in a certain way. They teach us how to farm. They teach us to eat grains. That means we're settled. We're not nomadic anymore. Right? We don't hunt deer. We grow lives. We cultivate what they call cultivate livestock. So sagely teaching then was constituted not only by the particular kinds of Confucian social relationships that value propriety, etc., but also what one ate, wore, and inhabited. Han Yu even has in his essay, he says there's certain kinds of houses that you live in. You don't live in the long houses of the indigenous people. We saw a photograph of them in the first lecture, right? So against the background of these kinds of origin stories and the Confucian intellectual milieu in which they flourished, we might revisit Chen's refusal in the record to grant the necessity of a great man to inaugurate key cultural practices such as writing. For both Yu Yonghe and Chen, the Formosan inhabitants are described by way of a temporal as well as a spatial difference. The Formosans are different not only because they occupy a different cultural space outside of China proper, but also because they appear to occupy a different point in time to that of contemporary Han civilization. For Yu, the indigenous population inhabit the same historical space as the Chinese, even if they are definitively behind them. This is what he means by saying they need 30 to 100 years and then they'll catch up with us. They require the expenditure of both effort and time before they can catch up to the seemingly inevitable goal. This is in the linear trajectory of Chinese-style civilization, and then become the happy, flourishing people they're even more ashamed than nature destines them to be. For Chen, however, the picture is more complicated, starting with his clear statement in the very first lines of the record of Formosa that he does not know the origins of the Formosan Islanders. His presentation of their history is therefore not self-evidently linked to either to a search for origins or to their placement as in a line of progression from savagery to civilization. It is in this light that we might reconsider his claim that these islanders belong to a mythical ancient utopia, that they are, in Chen's words, the people of Huai Betian. Now, Emma Dung has argued that this allusion to the people of Huai Betian links the Formosans to what she calls, quote, a pre-literate primordial era of peace and natural simplicity, unquote, in which their technological backwardness is figured as a form of primitive virtue. Her arguments here are again based on the putative similarity of Chen's text with knowledge. But another interpretation is possible. You probably knew this was coming. By comparing the islanders to people living under ancient emperors known for their virtuous governance, Chen could be read as endorsing the adequacy of their existing social arrangements by references to metaphors of political competence. Here, the islanders perhaps do stand as a primitivist trope, but a description of simplicity may function in a more radical way than Dung would assume. Specifically, it may serve to heighten the impact of Chen's explicit dismissal of the need for a great man, similar to those whom Chinese myths attribute the invention of such key cultural practices as writing and agriculture. And so far as he ascribes the Formosan Black Osage founder and their subsequent development to different forms of society to a historical contingency, that is something that that occurs as a happenstance rather than as a result of some kind of universal need or feature of the human condition, he seems to open the door to the possibility of an alternative timeline altogether. That is, the Aboriginals do not exist in the same time as Han Chinese, but in their own relative historical space, distinctive to them and to the path-dependent evolution of their culture. In doing so, Chen contemplates the quite radical possibility that civilization as the Han Chinese know it could possibly be otherwise. Here, we might reconsider Chen's claims to be the unofficial historian of the Formosan people. We discussed this earlier. The unofficial part of the story, the part of the story, lies in the fact that he reports on people and experiences that not only do not exist in official registers or histories, but that also lack obvious analogs or connections there. But the history part of this narrative also remains important. Chen shifts the emphasis away from questions about the natures of the indigenes, are they inherently good, rational, human like us, etc., towards their history. So he's asking a different set of questions, and I think that's important. At the same time, he recognizes that history is not necessarily equivalent to a story about their founders. In doing so, he opens space for a different set of questions to be asked about them. How did they get to where they have? How long have their practices endured? And might they change in the future? That is, the questions that can be asked the indigenous people are no longer about how they measure up to particular standards or express certain kinds of recognizable traits, but rather how they came to stand in their own present. He offers not a set of cultural contrasts, so of course these do punctuate his record, but a historical story about how a non-Han group came to exist as it has. It is important to note that Chen's perspective remains that of the Han Chinese. It is his voice and not those of his indigenous interlocutors which structures the ethnographic detail of the record. He therefore does not fully succeed in making the indigenous peoples subjects of his research. They remain its objects. So he doesn't quite measure up to the standard we would have for contemporary indigenous research in anthropology today, for example. But part of this project does include consideration of the historical consciousness of the Formosan Islanders themselves, opening a way for an understanding of the subjects of their own history. Whereas Yu Yonghe expresses frustration at their lack of a calendar or even awareness of how old they are, Chen simply reports, quote, "They have no calendar, no ray. They figure the full moon as 1 month and take 10 months as 1 year. After a time they forget and therefore cannot reckon their ages. Asking young or old, they do not know." Later he notes that younger members of the village will stand with their back turned, but an elder walks by, but generally they tend not to dwell on the specifics of age. It may be that in identifying them as the people of Wuhan and Etienne, Chen is offering his readers a familiar analog to what he believes the islanders' historical consciousness to be. Rather than the rigid, calendarically and genealogically defined sense of time that regulated more familiar Chinese social roles and rituals, the islanders remain outside marked historical time and instead inhabit a more relativized historical space. They know who is younger and older, but they do not care to extend this consciousness to the recording of history, which Chen's contemporaries associate with tradition, or to the specific ordering of collective or individual memory. By invoking ancient emperors and timeless Taoist utopias, Chen invites his readers to consider the differentiable lines of time that societies inhabit, without viewing any one line as somehow offering standards for the other. In the process, he produces a radically relativized account of how human societies endure and develop path-dependent, but nevertheless contingent and internally self-sufficient ways. So where does this very distinctive view on otherness come from? To understand his perspective, we must consider the distinct intellectual resources he brought to bear in his examination of indigenous society. These provide, I argue, an alternative Chinese genealogy of difference, one that can both stand as an instructive contrast to the Han-centric hierarchies of Chinese colonial governance prevalent in other territories of the Ming and Qing empires, and that also may provide a new perspective within broader global discussions at the intersection of difference, foreignness, and domination. So there are two distinctive parts to his background which I'm going to discuss here. First is his interest in the empiricist verification of ancient texts, a sort of trend, an intellectual trend that would later become known as Kaohsiung. And second, his lifelong interest in travel. I brought up both of these yesterday in response to questions, so here's some more detail about how these work for him. So in terms of Kaohsiung, before the relatively recent scholarly interest in Shendi as a chronicler of the indigenous society of Taiwan, he was mainly studied for his contributions to evidential learning. And this mode of scholarship or strict historical contextualization of classic texts, including factual verification of historical events, philological analyses, and proto-scientific rationalized methodologies for understanding the past. Those of you familiar with Wu Shu might know that he is one of the main people in modern China who brought to light he called it an explicitly scientific approach to the understanding of texts. So So Chen's work in this area is quite extensive and fascinating, but for now, I'm just going to note some very basic features. So unlike his contemporaries, who believed that the jarring near rhymes in ancient texts like the odes were ad hoc, Chen's research was built on the pioneering and quite vanguard belief that the language spoken by the ancients and used as the basis of rhymes in texts such as the odes and other works was actually different from that spoken in the present. So up until Chen Di, many Chinese scholars assumed that the rhymes didn't work in these ancient texts because they were just ad hoc. I guess the ancients didn't rhyme very well. Chen Di was one of the first people to sort of say, well, they did rhyme in the way that Chinese was spoken in ancient times. And this is a breakthrough. I mean, there's many phonologists today who still cite his work, like Bill Baxter, for example, if you're familiar with that, in other China. But what's interesting to me is that he explicitly ties his commitment to historical difference, his awareness that the past can be different from us, which was quite different. I mean, it sets him apart from his other contemporaries. Later, the shapeness became a more prevalent idea, but he was one of the first to really thematize it. So he explicitly ties his commitment to historical difference with a broader sense of contingency and a clear statement from his most well-known study, Investigation of Mountains, which is here. He says, quote, "Time has past and present. Earth has north and south. Written characters have transformations and reversals. Sounds have changes and shifts. This is inevitably how things go." Unquote. This statement clarifies that China has a commitment to a deeply historicized view of the past, by extension to a form of scholarship, Kaozheng, in which factual evidence and being marshaled to support philosophical doctrine ultimately took precedence over it. This relativized and historicized approach to difference found in the record of Formosa thus tallies with the substance of Chen's other work. In this context, Chen's question about why the Formosans never developed writing appears more as a scholarly query about historical change and possibility in the context of what is known about other societies. It does not appear, against his background of just giving you of his scholarly interests, does not appear as an assertion of self-evident Chinese superiority or the carefree simplicity of indigenous peoples. Now, the second interesting aspect about China is his propensity to travel. And in fact, he was known for his extensive travel, particularly after his retirement from official service. I was telling some of you yesterday, I don't think I told everyone, he was a garrison commander along the Great Wall, and when he was cashiered. So after this happened, he decided to just travel. And people have compared him to Xu Xiaohe and Yang Zhi, who were other great main travel writers. Although travel to foreign lands can entrench prejudices as much as unsettle them, of course, in Chen's case, this series of unusual experiences seem to have extended his already distinctive scholarly trajectory in new and rather deeply self-reflexive ways. Further elaboration of Chen's relativism and its connection to travel may be found in an overlooked text he produced alongside the record of Formosa, titled Gasset's Question of the Sailor, in which he provides answers to questions about Shen Yurong's very successful expedition raised by people who met him at the port when the expedition moored on Jimen Island. You know where Jimen is, so it's in between, it's claimed by Taiwan, but it's in between Taiwan and the mainland. When the guests go on to ask Chen who he is, they ask him just the question, who are you? And so he's answering all these questions with them about the strategy, how did they defeat the pirates, why were they so successful, how many ships did they have, how many people died. They're just asking him a series of factual questions. They finally get around to asking, well, who are you? Expecting him to give details about his name and status, okay? But instead he gives them this response. I replied, I have long forgotten myself, and I myself do not know who I am. So we already know that we're in trouble. He's not giving you a straightforward reply, right? I once hid on the Xuanyuan Mountains. The people who saw me called the sojourning guest of Xuanyuan. And you are a guest to me. I'm a guest to the Xuanyuan Mountain. The Xuanyuan Mountain is a guest to heaven and earth. Heaven and earth is a guest to the great emptiness. All are dependent. All are guests. What use is there to ask who is who? The guests then drew back and retreated. So after that, they're like, okay, great, thanks. You answered all the questions. You can go now. Weirdo. You know, like, it's funny. I came across this. I don't think anybody's ever talked about this text because it's buried in this compendium. Many of itself is quite long. But we know that it's a text written by Chen Di. So he's playing here, obviously. He's playing on his own self-identification as a sojourning or dependent guest of the Xuanyuan Mountain. And I've noted here, I didn't quite know how to use these. He's playing along the word dependent, Ji, and guest. But a Ji is like a sojourner, like somebody who sort of travels and just stays temporarily, goes from place to place. But then he also uses the word again, Ji, to talk about dependence, right? To talk about the mutually constituent nature of identity. And he invokes the Shen Mountain, which is the birthplace of Shen Yuan. This is another name of the Yellow Emperor, to claim all knowledge of otherness is somehow mutually dependent, or we might even say constantly sojourning or emotion. He here plays on the multivalence and grammatical fluidity of the word ke, in addition, which means guest, or in its verbal form, which would mean to live or settle in a strange place. By referring to his interlocutors as ke, as guests, here an honorific, meant to express respect to his counterpart, he situates them also amid his rumination about the nature of otherness and how we come to know it as different. Just as these interlocutors are guests to him, both strange and estranging, so too does such a relationship obtain between the basic components of the universe, each of which is dependent on other components for identity and meaning. So, on that note, to conclude and summarize, I've tried to argue that Chen offers a distinctive perspective, potentially an anti-imperial one, although that's subject to debate, within early modern Chinese discourse. As the author of the earliest first-hand account of indigenous society in Taiwan, he has been somewhat inaccurately associated with later justifications to colonize the island of the Qing dynasty. And yet, as I have tried to show, a closer look at Chen's record of Formosa reveals the historicist and relativist commitments of its author, who is careful to present indigenous society in Taiwan not as a mirror for Han Chinese failings, but as rather cultural failings, but rather as a unique opportunity to think differently about the past and the experience of the past that he and we associate with history. His perceptions of the simplicity of the indigenous peoples does not situate them behind the Han Chinese in time, because their lack of a founder teaching, writing, and other practices so valued by Chinese civilization does not lead Chen to conclude anything about their inadequacy or their backwardness. Rather, Chen, designating himself as Mr. Unofficial Historian, takes the radical step of associating them with a different timeline altogether. As the people who climb its end, the indigenes show that particular practices such as writing and recording of genealogy are contingent on the necessary features of human society. In this way, Chen cleverly uses the past to interrogate civilizational expectations and to expand his reader's consciousness of difference. On my reading, he offers one of the rare alternatives to the Xing discourse that structured much late imperial discourse about otherness, and offers then a potentially alternative, even anti-imperial perspective on the indigenous peoples of Taiwan. Thank you.
Quick question. So I'm wondering what's the information of the image you showed about the indigenous people?
Sorry, what is the...
There is an image you showed us.
Which one?
I think it's there's some hauntings, I think, like there at the beginning. Like
was it the Taiyuan image?
No, not Tao Yuan. Like it's
sorry, I just unplugged it.
It looks like
so it's live or
it's part
something
of
like
the album. Like is it?
Yeah, before that, right?
I don't think it's teacher because I have to go.
The ship?
No,
No.
2 or 3 years for this one.
This is a Leigh Ching. This is Leigh Ching. I talked about this 2 lectures ago. That's why I didn't mention or say anything about it. It's from a book. I think it's in the National Palace Museum in Taipei. A compendium of like ethnographic images of the Taiwan indigenous people. So it's been talked about a bit by people like Laura Hofstetler. They talk about the Meow albums. This was like an album.
Yeah. So it's not a parallel time, like it's...
No, it would. I think it's about 120 years later. Yeah. So it's not contemporaneous with Chen. It's not a main representation. It's Leigh Ching, or sorry, Leigh Ching.
Yeah, but actually I'm quite curious about like, how you compare this Chinese discourse on the Taiwan indigenous group and also the Southwest part, like the Miao group. I think that's a lot of, but I had to go with.
Oh, okay,
yeah. So
okay.
I want to ask you.
Oh, okay. We can talk later.
There's an art historian. Tell where you're going.
Professor
Craig Clunas is here.
And
she's an art historian. So
yeah, that makes sense. You better go see.
And he works on the kinds of women that she's also working. So
The courtesans.
Courtesans, right?
Yeah. Well,
I will come back.
no, it's okay. It's okay.
Okay, it's just 1 hour.
Okay. Right. Anybody else who wants to ask questions? Oops. It gives you a chance to think about it.
Sorry about that.
No. Do you need to go?
No, it's, I think they're just, it's my son's nursery, they're probably calling to see where he is, and I'm just calling some jokes.
Okay. So, who wants to go first today? Not I. What's I again?
No, I'm fine, no, I can do more than one thing at once. I can listen and write at the same time.
Yes. Yeah. You know, sometimes just. All right. Yes, go ahead.
Sure that Dongfang is Taiwan.
Are we sure that Dongfang means Taiwan? Yes. The reason I'm sure is there's maybe 6 or 7 references to the island of Taiwan called Dongfang in Ming Standard History. As I mentioned, grammatically it does not work in the Dongfang Zi to call Dongfang Eastern Savages. So in the translation that I gave you, the Lawrence Thompson translation, I should just, sorry. No, I believe, do I have this one? No, I don't have it. I don't have a reproduction of it. Text. The very first few lines. Sorry, I'm not locating it.
I'll have to find it.
Yeah, but it's like the very first few lines. There's actually, in the Lawrence Thompson translation, there's multiple interpolations of the word barbarian, which does not appear in Chen's text. He refers to his name. But then the Dongfang, it's ungrammatical, like the actual line itself cannot be read the way he's reading it grammatically to say Dongfang. There's only one place in the Dongfang Zi where Dongfang refers to people. But all of the other references, including in Chen's own work, including in his diary entries where he says we traveled to Dongfang, we traveled around Dongfang, like it doesn't make sense, like there's no grammatical way that it would function. I mean, we know that it's the name of a place. And there's been a Chinese study of this, pointing this out as if this is Dongfang is in the Ming histories refers to Taiwan. Like I cite a Chinese sort of text analysis of names for Taiwan, and they're saying they're going through all the names for Taiwan, the historical names for Taiwan, the Ryukyu Islands. There's their conflation in historical texts between the Ryukyu Islands, which now belong to Japan and Taiwan. But in any case, I feel fairly confident saying that's the case. It's apparently the name of a mountain. Like they could see Taiwan is very mountainous. They could see there was a mountain on it, and they called that mountain Dongfang, and that mountain became known as. Because it can also mean an eastern hedge or boundary, right? Not eastern barbarian. The fan here could be interchangeable.
I have a question to Chen's understanding of history. Like when he situates, as you said, the Taiwanese in an own historical space, kind of, but and on the other hand, he says that by taking a look at the Taiwanese or the Aborigines' cultural practices, he understands China's former history, right? Or he understands the Chinese past. So does he still draw connections between Chinese history and the things he sees in Formosa? So is history for him still one?
So what I'm saying that he does, I don't know that he reflects back on Chinese culture very much, of Chinese history, actually. So that's actually an important point. So the arrow goes one way. Like he's thinking about, I guess what I'm trying to show is the problem with this text is it's so short that you learn more about what he's trying to say by what he doesn't say than what he does. So he doesn't draw conclusions about their primitiveness on the basis of the fact that they don't have a great man founder to teach them writing and agriculture. He even says they wouldn't even make for a great man. So this would have been to his contemporary readers an obvious marker of, that would have been very shocking to them to sort of dismiss this need because it's seen as a universal feature of all human society. That you had to have the civilization that you just had to have some kind of person come and teach you things, right? But I'm not sure that he actually, so he's not, I think at the back of his mind, he's thinking about typical Chinese historical accounts. So I asked whether the standard histories or the way in which Confucians and Confucians tell stories about where we come from. State of nature is the way it's said. But he doesn't then reflect. I don't see him, I'm trying to think, I don't see him reflecting back on Chinese society, other than to say, oh, the primitive life is simple and easy, carefree life. They're being cheated by Chinese traders. That's the only time he versus the gays that think about Chinese. Other than when, of course, when he makes that comment about the deer feces. So that's self-reflexive, but it's not. I don't know if he's saying much about Chinese history. Although you all have read it, right? It's one of the primary sources for this. So you've actually read the account of English language version.
We have to go to the text if there's not a lot of. Unless you want to ask another question. Go ahead.
I was reminded of Ted while reading this. But do you think Chen has also an account of global history? For example,
Sorry, I couldn't hear the first part of what you said.
I said that I was reminded of the 19th century philosophers who also wrote about different cultures and subsumed them in a narrative of global history, such as Nico, people like that. So do you think Chen also has an account of global history, or does he have an account in which different cultures were positioned in accordance to each other in terms of hierarchy? For example, some on one end, or is history, for example, progressive or cyclical?
Well, so he had nothing that ambitious. This was very much a traveler's account. It's a G, like a record, which is just, I think I mentioned in the longer paper that his son wrote a, what do they call it, like he wrote like a preface where he explained my father was just a traveler. And the son says something about, oh, he teaches us all this crazy stuff about how weird people were over there. But Chen himself explains, why did I write this? He says, well, I came back from this trip and I told a friend what I had seen. He said, you should write this down because this is important. So I wrote it down. That's what Chen says that he did, because somebody really appreciated it. Now, the question of global history is an interesting one because we don't necessarily have to assume that it takes the shape that it did in Europe, right? What would global history mean? If we think about global history as an attempt to take account of how people across the world use time, or if we ourselves try to think about the way in which our own historical narrative has to change based on broader than local context, right? We recognize that there are different societies outside of our own, and if we try to write history in a way that reflects that possibility, then we can arguably say he's writing some kind of history. But it's not like a cataloging of difference. This didn't come into play in the Chinese case until the mid-Qing, where you do have proto-ethnographic accounts of the different barbarians, the tributary barbarians, the uncooked savages, the cooked savages. Basically, everybody who was paying taxes to the Qing Empire, they did have these books illustrating their cute little cultural differences, like the way they wore their hair, or the things they ate. Right? We have that for the Qing, but not anywhere like that. It should be much less ambitious. So those of you actually asked about, I assigned the piece by, I'm not even sure how to pronounce his name, Haney, Igor Patani. He's a Russian sinologist, but he writes a lot about the Ming. He wrote about Yang Shen. So Yang Shen was another traveler that Chen is often compared to. And I was interested in Yang Shen because someone said that he has a similar approach to Chen towards thinking about how to incorporate non-Han histories into, and his two are travel accounts, right? So maybe what we can say here is there was no such genre as global history writing for the Chinese, but there was a genre of travel writing. And in travel writing, you have these elites who are using their experiences of travel not only to reflect upon the cultural difference, but also to actually give a factual account how people were living in different areas, right? So in Yongshin's case, it was Yunnan. So still southern frontier.
You showed us one citation where Chen said something like, and who knows what the correct taste is, and how can there be similarities in what people have a liking for. So it kind of, for me, it sounds like very cool that it's not a thing in hierarchies. The Chinese know what good taste is like.
Yeah.
But the things he's make him aware that there are different ideas of taste and habits. So I just think it's very interesting reflection on cultural differences we can see here when we write about food.
And this is something as a political theorist, I'm always trying to identify, like trying to analogize into my own experience to see what the stakes of this claim would be. So I always bring up with my students the people who sort of deny that Eurocentrism exists. I always say that, do you know the Michelin star system? Michelin stars. The paradigm for good food, Michelin stars, is French cuisine. Is a certain kind of French cuisine. It's not like a global standard of food excellence. But what we take to be really good food is basically, people criticize the Michelin system on the basis of this, is the basis upon which a certain kind of food relates to the standard of French cuisine, right? How close it is to the standard of French cuisine. Very few Chinese restaurants have been given Michelin stars. Din Tai Fung in Taiwan is given one Michelin star. That was like an exception. Like the proportion of like French restaurants given Michelin stars is way out of proportion, right? And then when people talk about, for example, making Indian fine cuisine, they're trying to make it more like French cuisine with Indian flavor, using French techniques. So it actually is the case. I mean, we think that this doesn't affect us very much. We sort of say anybody can eat whatever they want. But if we're talking about another culture that's systematically eating bugs, like insects, for example, we might find that like dirty or disgusting or somehow primitive, right? I mean, I think we still have these kinds of reactions. So for him to go into a place like this and see them eating deer feces, like coming out of an actual deer. I mean, for one thing, they were eating one thing. They were eating higher than they were basically. But for him to say, well, yeah, like people actually vomit when they see this, but think about the indigenous people themselves, when they see the Chinese eating chicken, that's completely disgusting. For him to take this turn, I don't know if anyone can compare Chinese or European who goes that far and self-complexity. I don't know any. I mean, if you can think of any examples. People would always sort of give this at conferences and people say, oh, Montaigne, he talks about the cannibals, and he says cannibalism, even cannibalism is okay. But that's like, in fact, not at all what he's saying in that essay. He actually read the essay. He doesn't care about the cannibals at all, he just cares about himself and society. He's using them as a foil to think about himself. And not in a good way, right?
Should we go? Yeah.
I just want one question about Chen and his entire records. As he was already 60 when he arrived.
66, I think. Yeah.
66. So I'm thinking of it, can we actually think of it as just we are looking at it in comparison, which is really interesting. But can we think of the fact that while he was writing that, he didn't have any agenda. And as just like thinking of him as a tourist that went to his altar, he just visited some other place and then just wrote what he saw, and then behind that, that's the reason why we have this totally different perspective.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. I think that's important. I mean, so with the comparison to Yulong, what I was trying to get at partly is to sort of say Yulong was going at a very different kind of time. He was going to mine sulfur. He had a very specific purpose. He was, he knew that he was serving the Qing administration, was very nervous about the whole, going on the whole island itself. And then we have Chen, who, as you say, some old dude with no agenda. Right? He's a retiree, literally, like. I'm going to write that down. I'm going to mention he was a retiree, an old age pensioner, traveling around. So, in your opinion, does that make him more objective or less? How would that affect?
I think that it makes him actually less objective in the sense of that this record wasn't supposed to serve anyone.
Yeah.
And we can take it as a literal text, like as a literality. So none of the text that was supposed to give anyone any idea of something, which is something that he also wrote for his own pleasure, maybe in this sense.
Yeah, maybe it was written for his own pleasure. or that of his. I mean, so I guess the travel genre. I'm not a Ming specialist, but I know the travel genre of Ming was condemned by sort of more serious, straight-laced literati as being fantastical and sensationalist. A bit like the Sun. I mean, like these daily. You don't know the Daily Mail, right? It's like these tabloid newspapers. It was just meant to be like a shocking account of like these like customs here. I don't think that that's necessarily what he's up to, given his other. So these other, I mentioned his commitment to Paljam, his commitment to empiricist scholarship. That was all going on. He was writing a lot of that stuff before and after the travel to Taiwan. So I think he died when he was in his 70s. But he wrote the Mao Odes, his commentary on the Mao Odes, which is his most famous work, shortly after returning from Taiwan. So it wasn't the case that he was no longer engaged in just like scholarship of a very conventional literati kind. But it's interesting to me. And you mentioned the fact that he didn't have an agenda, but he was also like older.
Yeah.
Like the fact that he was an older person, he wasn't in his 20s. He didn't necessarily have any family commitments. I think his wife and his son had died a while ago. He was literally unattached. And I wonder what kind of implications that has for his account. And I don't mention that in the essay, but maybe I should. I think he was weird in so many different ways. He was distinctive in so many different ways. One other thing I wanted to ask you, since you all read, sorry, go ahead.
Can I maybe connect to this question a little bit, or as all of you? I forgot to ask the other question. How would you locate these descriptions in the maybe broader Chinese travel writing? And of course, I started doing a little bit of reading on Song dynastic descriptions of the northern barbarians, and but what also is there as a locus classicus, for example, would be maybe the descriptions in the official histories of the barbarians, which is also maybe before that, predating this style, because I always have to think of when there's like, they don't have this kind of ritual, they don't have this kind of tradition that we have, they don't know time, they don't know history, blah blah blah. There's for me at least, without not checking the original text and comparing it to Chiji or something, I always have to think of this typical reappearing notion. I'm actually now not sure if it's already in Chiji, but it's definitely in Song historiography on barbaric neighbors of the former dynasties, of course, now not Song writing. Yeah, but yeah, so can you... Is there maybe some interesting connection there, or do you think it's just the travel writing itself, or?
So what you're saying, these observations about the fact.
I think it's a typical way of describing. That's now a wild thesis. I don't have any.
No. This is.
It's just that there's a typical way of writing about others.
Yeah.
And that there are things that maybe a Chinese scholar expects to read about. If they have history, in the case of the North, of course, they have agriculture, but here it's also mentioned in this text that they have a specific way of going about agriculture. All this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It's the whole thing, when I look over it, looks familiar, and then at the end he even comments on it again, like in the historic tradition, like you would find it in the Shiji, or even in the historic writing of Ouyang Xiu, and this kind of because So another example is that I'm most aware of. I'm not sure about Tang historiography in this sense, if they would comment in the same way, but Ouyang Xiu and in Shiji you can find that they personally make references in the end of each paragraph or each chapter, and then say what they think about it, comment on it in some way, blah blah.
Okay, so they say that they're the unofficial historian. They say that they're the unofficial historian?
Yeah.
They do, so that's...
Yeah, that's right. It was just, it was an association I had to, so. But this is coming from my background and not being...
No, that's actually very important, right? Because then you're saying so it's a genre of writing in which there are certain conventions that are expected by readers.
Yeah, maybe not necessarily conventions, but something that you do and certain vocabulary that you use.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's that qualified in this case.
No,
Because
no,
it's not an official history, of course, so it doesn't have
Yeah.
to say.
So this is, in the paper and in your readings, we talk about Yang Shen a bit, right? Because Yang Shen also traveled to Yunnan and claimed to be like an unofficial historian of these Miao people in Yunnan. And that's where I sort of saw, the Chinese are doing the same thing. Because I haven't looked at travel writing that extensively. Because this is one of the strengths and weaknesses of the project. Because the project's looking at Taiwan, I'm trying to look at everything about Taiwan. Then I'm missing things where it's like, okay, well, this would be hitting you over the head if you read a lot of travel accounts, the same, formula or like a genre of presenting information. So could I ask you?
It's two things, like the travel writing is one thing, and the other one is like the codified history, like when they have in the 24 histories,
Okay.
always is like chapters on the variants, chapters on the neighbors, whatever, and
Okay.
typical things they describe in there. I think it's, of course it's a gigantic thing, but I had to think of it.
Yeah, so, this is ties into the question I was going to ask you as the discussion, I'm interested to know your opinions. Does this mean, given Chen's indebtedness to other modes of writing, or the fact that he's writing for a specific audience, he himself is not Chinese, right? Does this mean that he has an invariably prejudiced view of looking at others? Like, is there any way that he could write I use the word objective, and these reviewers for the historical journal that they took issue with the word objective, which I wasn't meaning in any way that sense, I just meant. Well, while you're thinking of this question, the comparison I had in mind was someone like Montaigne or John Locke, for whom the particularity of indigenous peoples didn't matter. Like, they didn't notice that they didn't care that they were actually all different, that they had different tribes, they had different modes of social organization, they ate different things, they did different things, that they were not just a blank slate upon which we project our own fears and anxieties and questions about political life. So if you read somebody like them, and you go to reading something like Chen Di, actually Chen Di does make quite a big deal about being very specific about the details. And the details he gives us, we know tally with later Dutch accounts of these pre-colonial indigenous peoples on Taiwan. Like the idea that they're headhunters, they hunt deer in specific ways, these are their burial practices, these are marriage practices, like all of that. It's detailed enough that it's not just a generic gesture about like, this is what primitive people look like. They're all super violent. Like Leigh Chen walks out, they're all super violent and just run around the mountains. You don't even know they look like monkeys or whatever. Like you don't have that kind. You have a very different kind of account. But at the same time, he's still a Chinese. Let me make it a little bit easier. Do you think it's ever possible to write about others in an objective? No, probably not. Then should we just give up doing it? Like we should just do away with anthropology. I'm serious. This is the kind of question like with Mencius, where it's like, let's think about when the rubber hits the road. Like, actually, what's at stake for Mencius, for example, to say that we have a human interest in it? Like, what would that mean for us, right? So what would it mean for Chen Di to go and kind of to make a record of what he sees? Would we be able to do the same thing with that level of objectivity? Or maybe not. Maybe it's important to know that Chen Di is satisfying a specific kind of audience. He's coming from a very particular background. Mikal and Ariel.
But do we take Chen Di as a part of as a person who's taking part in the civilizing process, or not? Or we're taking him from outside of that?
Well, you asked me. I asked you. You tell me.
So the answer is somehow that we should look at him from outside of this process. As a person who's around, like not engaging in that directly. And if we're looking at other travelers and also looking from the European perspective, I think we could also be able to somehow separate people who are taking part in that and they saw their mission. in arriving to other places and looking at the others, and those who were just doing that in order to create some writings. So I think that it could be somehow, and then the question of objectivity, I'm not sure if it would be also possible to say that they were strictly objective, because in the case of Taiwan is really interesting because we have different accounts from different places, so we can actually see that this otherness is also being created between Dutch and indigenous and Japanese also further later. And all of those accounts create a very interesting image. But looking from the perspective of one, like only two parts, then this objectiveness will never appear, I think.
This is very much a discussion. It's always good to be a seminar leader and have a discussion because there's always going to be questions you yourself don't know the answers. You say, students, what do you think? You know, because I have some ideas, but I can sort of see both sides of it. And I think the way you formulated it, Nicole, is very powerful. Like, are we seeing him as part of the civilizing process? Is he so we could say objective. Now I'm afraid to use that word objectively, but like if we take a step back, maybe he wasn't, just because you said he didn't have an agenda in the way that other later travel writers did.
One quick question in between, like how strongly, widespread was this account? How important is it as a text? How many people have actually...
This account for Chen?
Yes.
So what happened was, and again, I feel like I've explained this yesterday, but only to certain groups of people, so if I'm repeating myself, I apologize. But so the text, this was in response to me as a question about the response of other people to these texts. So Chen Di's text was reproduced in gazetteers, local gazetteers about Taiwan, as well as the compendium of Words of Praise from the Taiwan Sea, as well as later accounts like travel, sort of like compendium of like travel information for administrators going to the island. But nobody knew that it was his account, and it was reproduced. And in fact, it was also reproduced in Zhang Xie's Dongxiang. So many people, which is a compendium of lots of different things. Like Zhang Xie just sort of took every bit of information about foreign people and just plugged it all into like one encyclopedia. Like, here's the whole Nile, like here's the red hairs, here's the Franks, which is the Portuguese, the Formosa. I don't know why they call Franks. Here's this is what the Portuguese are doing. They're running around, they're trying to get the China trade, whatever. And then here's Taiwan, and he had actually reproduced part of Chen Di's account within that, while adding all this other stuff about Danshui and Zidong. So for a long time, people didn't know that there was like a separate text called Chen Di's Dongfanti, and it was actually discovered by Japanese, I guess a geographer, a historical geographer during the Japanese occupation of Taiwan, colonization of Taiwan, who was doing work on place names, and he discovered an original copy of Chen Di's text, but he didn't know what it was. He was just using it as a reference to figure out the geography of the place and like how where things were, where villages were, and everything, what the names of things were at the time. And then a Catholic priest named Fang Hao, who had fled. So this is a very long question. Fang Hao, who had fled to Taiwan in 1949. I think he was a sociologist, but he suddenly became very interested in Taiwan history, and he stumbled across this annotated manuscript in the Japanese Imperial Library in Tokyo. It was annotated by this Japanese geographer, and then Fang Hao was one of the first people who realized what he had in front of him. It was like the original account from which other accounts had been derived, and then he published a very long piece in the 1960s, sort of doing the typical Chinese text analysis, like peeling back the layers and figuring out that this was in fact Chinese text. So it had circulated all over the place, but nobody understood it as a text by Chen Di, written under these circumstances. Right? People just thought it was an account of the indigenous people. They didn't know who had written it or in what context.
Yeah, but then by accident, it is definitely part of the civilizing process, right? Because when it's taken up so broadly and even put into encyclopedic, then it's definitely something that is of this is to be seen in this context at least involuntarily, so to say, without the.
I see what you mean. Oh, okay.
I mean, every text gets is of course just goes on something, but when it develops then further, and then it has a life of its own again, and it doesn't matter if the author has like some more maybe humanistic intentions, or if it's just taken up by people after even his death in some cases. So, yeah.
So should that change how we read the text?
Not necessarily, but it is like coming from a historic perspective. Of course, you would say that this is the context in which you can see it, and then you have this both these things. Like on the one hand, is maybe some more understanding view towards this other, and then on the other hand, it has this history when it's taken up later and can be used in this different ways.
Yeah. Can I ask then a follow-up question? Because you've all read Emma Dunn's work, because obviously she's the main target. I feel kind of bad, because it's a great book that she's written. I like it very much, and I admire it very much, but she's totally wrong about Chen. In my opinion. She's just totally wrong about Chen Di, backwards and forwards. But here's a way in which she might be right. So what she's basically doing is kind of taking the broad discourse about Taiwan and like putting it into some kind of organized account. She's saying that we can organize this discourse in several ways. There's a discourse of primitivism, there's a discourse of deprivation, or privation, I think she calls it. That these discourses reflect not the objective reality of what's going on in Taiwan, but rather the preoccupations of Chinese liberality there. And as a result, we can organize them into we can organize them as pieces of a historical. They're historical artifacts that we can organize into discourses. She organizes them into discourses or into particular kinds of, by their features, by what they do in history. So if we organize things by what they do in history, then I think, Patrick, your approach would be to say, Chen Di's text is part of the civilizing process because it's been taken up and used in these ways. It's been used as an administrative text to sort of figure out, okay, when these administrators are going to tell me, what am I getting myself into here? Okay, there's these indigenous people, and oh my God, they eat deer feces. So that's interesting, but not that bit is often excised from these reproductions. So this is another question we can ask is what gets reproduced, what gets changed, what gets excised. And that bit is often excised. I think I mentioned that in the talk about the deer feces, but all the stuff about like the head hunting and the barrow practices, that's the stuff that gets put in. So in terms of what it does contribute to the civilizing process. But in terms of what it says, which is, I think, it doesn't. I mean, I think, well, that's my view anyway, that it is, this is why I started off calling it an anti-imperial text, because it seems to present a perspective that's so distinctive and unique. You have to understand a bit of the authorial perspective, like the actual author himself, like his particular background. It's contingent, maybe, okay, but his way of looking at the world is deeply historicized. It recognizes that there's difference across time as well as across space. Then it's not. I mean, then no matter how it's used, right? It's but I struggle with this because when I offer reading some texts in this way, historians often say, well, it almost doesn't matter what he intended by it, because we can't always know what he intended by it. What matters is how it was used. And we know how it was used. We know it was used in a civil, as part of this administrative civilizing process, or whatever you want to call it. I would like to think there's value in non-reading. Not everything.
I think I'm actually with you on the point of reading the text, first understanding what it says without excluding the other possible interpretations. But returning to the previous question as to whether it's possible to write about others subjectively, I think that's a very intriguing question. And I sometimes wonder myself whether it's even desirable to write about others objectively, because I think an interesting analogy is to be drawn between writing about others and writing about the past.
Yes,
It's possible to think about people from remote places as we do the ideas from a distant past, right? And sometimes people would say Nietzsche said this in the Use and Abuse of History, that all in the past should be hated if it doesn't serve our present life or something. So I think besides reading history as it is, or reading history and seeing how it's used, a third alternative would be to see what the past means to us in the present. I think that matters more. Yeah. So I think the ideas are interesting in themselves for sure, but the implications for us is also part of what makes it interesting.
But, okay, doesn't political theory take into account, I mean, there's this work by Johannes Fabian called Time and the Other. In anthropology, in anthropology, this kind of a question has been addressed for a long time, and basically he sort of started off this huge controversy saying that anthropology needs to take the I, that is the so-called objective observer, but actually the observer, into account, and by doing so, you distance yourself somehow from both the object and what you are representing in the subject, right? And that way, you at least sort of give the reader a possibility to also measure you and the way that you measure whatever you represent.
Yeah.
Right? And I mean, is that helpful, or is that being used, or? I mean, I just came across this because we were having this discussion about epochs and periodization, like your group, and we were looking at other ways of periodizing and sort of getting commensurate, which is, it's all a question of trying to describe the other in an adequate way. That is sort of adequate to the other, right?
Well, the question then is how. I guess it all has to do with why am I? So what am I doing? Why am I here? Because Barbara invited me. No,
practical.
But what am I doing with all this? So I became very interested in the possibility of how can we articulate difference as legitimate. I've said this several times. Maybe you're getting sick of hearing me say it, but is it because I think there's a normative reason that there's a real point in trying to understand otherness in a way that's fair, because if we describe otherness in certain ways, it implies that it creates a power over that other. If we describe the other in a way that makes them inferior, or that situates them behind us in time, then it makes it easier for us to try to dominate them. So this is where the political theory comes in. It's not about necessarily being objective or contextual. It's necessarily about this worry that unless we do something the right way, something bad will happen. The bad thing that will happen in this case is we become, as I mentioned when we talked about mentions, if we talk about others in ways that dehumanizes them, we may be more likely to try to dominate them or to give them less care and obligation, less care or attention than we are obliged to do by some theory of justice. And that might be a problem. I mean, it would depend on what your theory of justice is or what you think. It depends on your normative theory. Maybe you don't care, maybe it's not a problem. But for someone like Chen, he's very interesting because he's actually giving us a way of describing otherness that doesn't mandate a kind of colonial gaze, right? It doesn't mandate it can't be used to justify the colonial exploitation or domination of these people, because it doesn't present them as inferior, but it also doesn't just see them their particularity erased in the service of the self-reflection of our own society. So you're right, Barbara. It does. It's kind of it sounds like me and what I'm concerned about.
No, the question is, I mean, the anthropologists, to my mind, I mean, they sort of put this into to excess, right? And so the high becomes extremely important. Whereas in history and in political science, I guess, or political science especially, it seems to me the eye is completely remote. I mean, the author doesn't come in. I'm not so sure in political theory how you, because there, you always, like you said yesterday, and I thought it was very interesting for me, that you are actually reflecting upon a historical text from the point of view of the contemporary,
Yes.
in order to basically further your own thinking, which is kind of philosophy, right?
Right.
Which is something that, for a historian, that's slightly difficult, right? Because we're trying to retrieve what's in the text only in that context.
Yeah, but we have this discussion. So
Yes,
you guys may or may not know this. So I have an attachment to Heidelberg that goes beyond just my attachment to Barbara, which is that I'm on a grant project with Joachim Kurtz, and the grant project is called East Asian Uses of the European Past. And I'm the only political theorist, the rest of them are all historians, right? So first I thought this is a recipe for trouble, but actually it wasn't, because now I'm just educated basically in how historians think, not just by being told this is what historians think, but actually having to sort of talk to the team, other team members, and also read what they were reading, and then trying to formulate a research agenda on this basis, right? And one of the things that surprised me is that, in fact, all history is presentist in some way, because you have to have a motive for writing it. And even if your motive for writing it is deeply historicist, as Chen was, right? Mm-hmm. There's still a point to it. It's like, well, what is it? And in political theory, you mentioned Ariel Quentin Skinner. I don't know how many of you are familiar with his work, but in the 1960s, this has been going on for 50 years. He's still alive, by the way. I'm going to like a fetch shrift for him some next year. It's 50 years ago, and he was like a grad, newly minted PhD. He wrote a bunch of articles about how we have to understand these political figures, these canonical figures. His main big one was Thomas Hobbes. He loves Thomas Hobbes. How we have to understand them in context in order to really understand what they're saying, right? Because they couldn't have said some of the things that people are ascribing them as saying, because in his view, he said these people are looking from the present and expecting Thomas Hobbes or John Locke or whoever to answer their questions. He said that's like playing a pack of tricks on the dead, right? How can we expect them to answer our questions? How can I expect Chen to answer my questions? Now, the tricky thing, though, about Quentin Skinner, as years went on, people tried to nail him down as to, well, if all you want to do is historicize the past, and it's just an exercise in antiquarianism, what's the point of it? And then he'd say, well, because I want to understand the emergence of the modern state. The emergence of the modern state, he says, has it's ineluctably tied to a set of European thinkers, and this is why he doesn't study non-European thinkers. So there is a presentist under, once you really push it, okay, why these thinkers? Why not someone in Japan? Why not Chen? You can study anybody using this technique if it's just a methodology for understanding things in their context, ideas in context, which is how he sort of labels what he does. Why not study it? Well, because there is a point to it, right? It's not just dusty antiquarianism. It's not just trying to prove a point about what the past was like for no reason. There is always a reason. His reason was to understand the modern state, which is and it's a profoundly Eurocentric view. Profoundly Eurocentric. When people challenge him on, he says, "Well, I'm actually interested in Republican freedom. We don't have any record of this as it was actually practiced in non-Western states." Like when so to me, I think that's historians say that you're using the past for your purposes. Well, guess what? We all are, right? How else could we use it? It's an analogous question to the one that was raised in this discussion about can we ever really understand foreign others, differently situated, cultural others, whatever you want to call them. Just as we understand Ariel, when we drew this analogy, we talk about people in the past. Those are others to us, just as we talk about cultural others, right? But it matters how we represent them.
And in this discourse of thinking about the cultural other, I think what we learned in transcultural studies is really interesting because we said that we cannot, or in transcultural studies, we're trying to understand the other and us in mutual exchange process. So we are shaping the others and the others are shaping us. And it's really interesting. I'm thinking if we could also connect Chen Di's way of writing about the other, kind of link it to a transcultural discourse to some extent. I don't know, but
you mean because he lets the other shape him in that sense?
Yeah, kind of.
But doesn't?
Does he really?
Is it visible?
Well, that's the question. I don't know. I think he might. Because this turn, this I call it the self-reflexive turn or something, where he says, well, when Chinese see them eating this, they vomit it. When they see Chinese eating chicken, when they see us doing the thing that we take to be totally natural and even delectable, right? Delicious. Lecker. Is that how they call it? Right, the chicken is really lecker, right? Well, but they don't think it's lecker, they think it's disgusting and it makes them vomit. And recognizing that seems really profoundly. He is reversing the gaze, is that the word for it? He's looking at himself through their eyes and saying, well, we don't necessarily measure up all that well either, right? And I think.
Also, does he do this kind of shot reverse shot?
The shot reverse shot.
I mean, no, because there's this very nice children's book. I don't know whether you children have read it, but it's called Jim Knopf and the Engine Driver, right?
Was
Jim
it
Knopf and Lucas the Engine Driver, and it's this they anyway these two people, a little black boy and someone driving an engine. They go to China. And they end up meeting this person, and he offers them food. They're really, really hungry. And he keeps offering all these things that, in China you eat, but in Europe you would find disgusting. Like insects,
Yeah.
He's like, oh, this delicious blah, blah, blah. And they go white. Yeah. And so then the engine driver says, so little ping pong, why don't you just offer us a piece of bread with cheese? And then ping pong goes white, because then he says, but cheese, that's basically sour milk.
Yeah.
And so he's disgusted. And so the disgust is on both there, you can see it, but in Chandi, this kind of situation doesn't really, or is it there? So that you can actually see both sides, and then you understand, it depends, right? And it's sort of.
You don't think so? I think part of the problem, like I said, his text is so short, and the reviewers for this essay that I wrote, they were saying you were reading so much into it. I get that a lot, though. I get it. Maybe it's my tendency, but the fact is that there's not that much to be read. So what I do try to do is expand on his other work. I look at his Jenco, what do they call it, chronological biography, which incidentally was written in 1934 before it was known that Chen was the author of this piece. So the chronological biography includes a lot of excerpts from his travel writing, which I've looked at, and then the other work that he wrote alongside this, the Joshua, the weird thing where he's like, who am I? I'm a sojourner in the Shanghai Mountain. None of that has ever been examined, so in some ways I'm trying to broaden the context to get a sense of where he's coming from, because it can't all be found in the text itself, it's just too short. But the fact, for example, that what doesn't he say? He doesn't say that he's barbarous, he doesn't come and say they're bloodthirsty. But he observes it, he sort of says they hang heads above doors. If you saw that, if you genuinely actually saw that in real life, and you're like, I am in the middle of a place where people are actually conducting headhunting, wouldn't you be frightened and kind of shocked and a little bit disgusted if you saw human heads above a door? Wouldn't you? Yeah, you would. I think, come on. You would be like, oh my God. And then you'd be like, is mine next? That would probably be my next question. But, so I think the fact that he's seeing these things and recording them in a kind of calm, empirical way, it says a lot about what he's doing. So we get the reverse shot when he talks about the Chinese eating chicken. The indigenous people. So isn't that the kind of thing that we're actually? To me, that's quite definitive. What we're talking about. Now, whether he can be objective, in your view, do I succeed in showing that the text is anti-imperial? Because that's the concept. So then we're talking really, it's the same thing, it's a version of the same question. We're talking about what does his representation of indigenous otherness do? Now we know what its own history is. It has been used for part of the civilizing process, as we call it. But what does it actually do as a text? What does it do as a text? Could we read it and come to a new understanding about how to situate otherness?
If we're thinking thinking about it in identity studies,
And you haven't read it, but you've read it, right?
the text there.
Yeah.
So if we're thinking about identity studies, the identity is always created on the basics of otherness. So our identity is based on the identity of others. Otherwise, it's not possible for it to emerge in any sense.
Yeah.
So as Mia said earlier about creating his identity, the Chinese identity through looking at them, it also had contributed to that. But it was also, we would have to think about who he saw himself as.
Yeah.
In the sense, if he saw himself as I thought also said earlier, of course he was Han Chinese, but what did he see his role as in this sense?
Yeah, how did he see himself? Did he see himself as a Han Chinese traveler, or did he see himself as something else?
This is hard to, I don't know the answer to the question because
I mean, we have some clues, right? Because we know that he saw himself as a sojourner of Shen Mountain, right? So he's something I didn't bring up, but that was also prevalent in the Ming Dynasty was this obsession with the Shen Hygiene. Do you know Shen Hygiene is a record of mountains and seas? I don't know how it's basically a tales of the strange. And it records wondrous things seen and heard. You know, a lot of it's like, weird mythical things. And so that also could be, it was very popular in making it. Maybe that was also behind his thinking about like reporting these wondrous things he was seeing, right? Was he contributing to this kind of shock value kind of discourse? Or was he reading what he saw through this discourse? But I know that, we know that he saw himself as a sojourner, right? So even if we accept that he saw himself as a traveler, right? It's maybe a man of the world, like cosmopolitan in a way. That might also be a kind of, we can then see that the Dongfen, see the record of Dongfen, the record of Formosa as itself a self-serving kind of. It's kind of like a notch on his belt or something about like, now I've been to Taiwan, I've been to someplace nobody else has ever been. That could also be an attitude he takes, right?
But this passage about the mountain is really interesting to look at him as he himself saw himself detached somehow from mainland, from Han China.
Yeah.
He says that to whom I belong.
Yeah.
And the question is, what was his identity? If his identity was not grounded enough, maybe this is what gave him a different view than anyone else was.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, personally, I see him as aligned along with Zhuangzi here, where basically in that passage, he's saying everything's dependent on everything else, right? We don't know our identity. Who am I? I don't know, because my identity is dependent on other things, right? I'm a guest. I move around constantly, and who I am is based on where I am, right? Like it's not like I don't have a singular identity that travels in a consistent, persistent way throughout time and space. Rather, it changes constantly on the basis of where and when I am. That was how I read that passage. This is very Zhuangzian, right? It doesn't necessarily, and I think in that case, another thing I could ask you is how you see this tallying with the other views on otherness that we've read. Including Yu Yonghe, which we're reading as a primary source for this particular discussion. Yu Yonghe gives a very different perspective on Taiwan, right? Is one of them better than the other? And on what terms would it be better?
Yeah, I think I'm very convinced by your argument. I think Yonghe's account has more dangerous implications because how easily it could be abused to justify violent attacks. But here I also wonder, so in the reading that you assigned, following the piece of Dongfanzi, there's another piece called Qi Dongfanzi Hou, also written by him, but the text wasn't complete. I wonder whether there's something in it that Chen Leigh comments on his own previous writing about
Yeah.
when he said something.
Yeah, but he says, I told someone about this, and I said to write it down.
Well, he didn't mention, for example, his intention of writing it, right?
No, it's weird. I mean, people ask me this all the time, but what's there is all that we have, right? And this isn't incidentally all of mine. Wikipedia Seneca has a database of all of these Taiwan materials. And I've read through a lot of it, and the kinds of attitudes that people like Emma ascribe to Chen Di are found in a lot of the appended comments on this account by his son and grandson, I think it was, who tried to kind of, well, after he had died, they tried to revive interest in him, I guess, is to try to revive his culture, promote it or preserve it. And they sort of say things like, isn't this is so strange and weird? But Chen Di himself doesn't make those weird, he doesn't make those extreme claims about what he's done. It's very simple. This guy Fang Hao, the Catholic priest who became a Shinto history, he also doesn't say, I mean, he wrote a very long piece about like, where this text came from. He doesn't say anything about he doesn't raise any additional information about what Chen Di's intention would be, other than what's there.
Okay. But in the meantime, I also feel that when Chen Di was treating the indigenous people while documenting all the particular details, he was also not commanding respect for them, or it's not requiring further understanding of anything. Because normally in the contemporary context, when we talk about tolerance or coexistence between multiple cultures, sometimes living together unmurderously is not enough, and understanding of the other is also a prerequisite. But here I think Chen Di, he does it himself, but he's also not commanding his readers to, pay equal attention or respect to the others.
Oh, I see. So he's also not making the stronger claim to like respect and be good to them, right? He could have, I see what you mean. So he could have taken the time to write one more sentence and say, therefore, I recommend that no one ever go to Taiwan, leave these people alone, they're good people, but he didn't. Right. So he didn't take that. That's interesting too. I never thought about it that way. So the fact that he didn't, do you think that should change how we read it? Or do you think he was just trying to make that? He's sort of saying, I'm giving information, I'm not telling people how to use it, right?
I think it wouldn't undermine your argument, but it also doesn't follow directly that he is recommending multiculturalism, for example.
Oh, yeah.
It's like in Montaigne. Montaigne is by no means recommending, respect for the capitals. Right?
Yeah.
Different. And at certain moments, the theory couldn't prevent violent acts against the others.
Yeah.
When there are interests overriding.
I'm going back to the rhetorics question. Would it be helpful to be looking at the absence or the presence of these kinds of concluding remarks in terms of what the Taishi says at the end of the historical writing, right? Where they give an evaluation of, okay, this is a good person or this is a bad person, which in this writing doesn't appear in the same sense, or and is that the question is and the question is that a deliberate change, because this is different type of writing, this is a different genre of writing, obviously it's not historical writing, but Chinese does have this kind of evaluation of the text of whoever they're talking about. And so there would have been a possibility, and he doesn't take up this possibility.
Well, he has that bit about the unofficial, Mr. Unofficial Historian says, that's sort of his closing remarks. This is how different are they? But in the account, the translation I gave you, Lawrence Thompson translated, is how strange are these people? But the word is E, like it just means
exactly.
Right? So it doesn't necessarily mean strange. You just how different are they?
Yeah.
So that could be his sort of moral, his 2 cents, his moral conclusion, right?
So the question is, my question really is, if you look at it in terms of particular genre rhetoric, where does it confirm, where does it differ from that rhetoric, and would that be helpful to find out find out more about the question of objectivity that we were kind of approaching earlier?
Yeah. I see what you mean. So then you really have to do, I mean, it is a really deep dive, and you have to like sort of figure out what kind of genres, what he could have said but didn't,
Right.
in a way.
I'm
By the
thinking of-
conventions of Chinese historical writing or Chinese travel writing.
Well, I'm thinking of William Arendt's myth of cannibalism, right?
Sorry, about the...
Where he talks about cannibalism as a myth, and basically the way that he does it is that he shows that there's a certain rhetoric in colonial writing about cannibalism, which is always used, which basically uses the same kinds of phrases, and there's usually no ocular proof. They haven't actually seen it, they've heard of someone, blah, blah, blah. And so he basically unravels that most of these accounts may actually not be testimony for cannibalism at all, right? Because of the kind of rhetoric that is being replicated and used by writers that are inspired by each other, right? And this is the way that the civilized mind speaks about cannibalism. This might actually be very helpful in looking at these kinds of descriptions, right?
Who is this? Sorry.
William Arendt.
Arendt.
Yeah, Arendt. Arens. And it's called The Man-Eating Myth. That's what the book is. It's in late 70s, I think.
Okay.
And it was a big debate because he basically, said cannibalism doesn't exist anywhere in the world, which of course is an exaggeration, but he was trying to make a point. So, and I think it's very interesting in terms of how it was taken up, especially then in literary studies, in terms of rhetorics and their significance.
Should we, I realize that we've gone so long, we haven't taken a break.
Yeah, we don't have to take a break. We can also continue. It's up to you. But I wonder whether you want to dig deeper into the text that you assigned.
We can do, you mean the primary text?
Yes.
If we can do. One of the things I actually wanted to look at, let me try to find it here, is the way in which it's been translated. The origin of the Eastern barbarians is unknown. They dwell in an island in the ocean beyond Hong Kong, so all of this is they. That's actually ungrammatical. It can't actually function that way. It just sort of says this is that the Dongfan is an island in the ocean beyond Hong Kong. So now I don't have the Chinese at hand. So in reading this, so if you check, this is on page 172 of the Lawrence Thompson translation, right?
172?
Yeah. So now you've actually you've read the actual account yourself. Those who have many skeletons hanging at their doors are culprits. Actually, this is
It only goes to 172.
more lurid detail, but the fact that he's giving us so many facts, I was just curious, before you heard my talk, and presumably you did the reading before you came to the talk, right? What was your impression of this text? I'm just curious, because I've been working on it for so long, but I no longer have any first impressions about it. I'm kind of far beyond it. But I'm wondering, did you think that this was just a typical pageant where you're just oh yeah, I've seen this before. This is typical Chinese account of that. You did think it was pretty typical?
Yeah, that's my reaction. I'm sorry.
No, there's no sorry. It's fine. I'm genuinely curious. So, can I ask, as somebody who knows more about other accounts than I do, are the kinds of details he's giving, are they unusual?
I'm not sure. I'm also not that. I only know this one genre, and I'm still in the beginning of reading this stuff. There's stuff like Magda or something where they have all this many chapters on many different aspects of the nomadic peoples, also describing their dwellings. I'm not familiar how much self-reflexiveness is there, especially in this his last passage here, what we just talked about again, when he's even saying in the very last sentence that they are like they don't need this cultural stuff because they live in this paradise or something. They have enough food. The paradise is now, of course,
like a utopia.
being a little bit hyperbolic, but this is. I really would have to check again with this earlier sources that I'm familiar with. They have this notion because I think that might be very different. But this when I just go over the text of this, of course I don't realize that. I just like see and then I'm like, oh, this sounds familiar. They have no history. Blah blah. They don't have a sense of time. They don't have houses, like they have different houses, and so that's
Okay. Is it then not the case? I hate to delve into like cultural essentialism. It's in the West. There's a political theorist named Sankar Muthu who makes the claim that it was only when Western writers acknowledged, when they started to picture the other as culture-producing beings. That is to say, when they started to see these indigenous people of the New World as themselves capable of having a culture, something called a culture, that they were capable of recognizing them as human and thus were less willing to engage in colonizing acts against them. Right? And that this was the only way that they could see legitimate difference, right? It was like this invention of cultures and seeing humans as culture-producing agents. Because up until that point, they weren't able to see them as much more than tropes. They were just examples of primitivism or of this state of course, state of nature was the main one, European writers, right? So if that was, the reason this is interesting to me is because he's trying to make the claim that something has to happen in order for us to represent otherness in a way that makes us not want to dominate others or not want to extend a certain kind of colonial relation over them. Even if that relation is merely discursive, to use a post-colonial term, is that even if it's just a claim about our superiority that's embedded in discourse, even if we don't actually go use violent acts to like overtake them, dominate them. So it would seem, on the basis of Patrick's extensive research, we can conclude that there isn't a Chinese way of acknowledging difference. Because all we have, the other possibilities we have are, I mentioned these Qing quasi-ethnographic accounts that are really meant to be administrative manuals for officials coming into new areas where they're expected to kind of deal with, like different kinds of minority groups, what we call minority groups, right? In these southern frontiers and northern frontiers, right? And that's kind of depressing. I mean, on one level, I might say, well, no human can ever represent difference in a way that is not reflective of some kind of power dynamic, some kind of inequality between self and other. On the other hand, it might be that, once again, we have this variety of argument. Only the West has the formulation to present otherness in this way. But it seemed to me that the problem that I have with accounts that say, well, the Chinese can never represent others, so I'm using Patrick as an example, and I feel really bad. I'm not meaning to like denigrate your opinion in any way, but this is a very common response that I get to my reading of text in general, but to this reading in particular. People say, well, Emma Doug basically had it right, because Emma Doug says, well, this is just an example of like how Chinese view others in a way that's totally self-serving. And in her view, I don't think you would read her book and you wouldn't come away with any impression that there was any possible way that any Chinese writer could ever represent difference in a way that was objective or not self-serving, like in a very direct way. But I want to say that there is such a way, and that we found it in Chen. But at the same time, I recognize the strength of arguments like Patrick, where they say, well, this is just very common, you see this over and over, there's nothing really special about this account, it's just a genre, it's very emblematic of the genre which it's writing. But then that's kind of depressing, because then we say, well, there's no possibility of representing difference in Chinese discourse. And that's kind of it's kind of culturally essentialist, but if you can't think of a counterexample, then yeah. Oh, Patrick, okay.
Just to be
defend yourself now.
Just to be clearly understood, I don't mean that it's. First of all, I think you are. I don't say that your argument is not convincing regarding this text. I just thought that my first thought when I read the text was like, oh, this sounds familiar. Then, secondly, I said regarding the song travel, I'm really not sure. I would have to check it. It's just not how I read the text until now, because I'm looking at very different things. For me, the difference between sedentary life and nomadic is more important than any of this cultural hierarchy thing in this regard. Or better to say, for me, it lies in this. It doesn't matter now. And thirdly, what is important, I think, for even more beyond that, more past history. Usually, what I said also yesterday, there's this people are talking about Chinese, the ancient text in not the ancient philosophical, but the ancient historic text, so the first two, like Han Shu and the Shi Ji, in the context that they are different, so that Sima Qian has some ethnographical interest that is different to, and also some kind of understanding that is different to the Han Shu. So maybe this would be a place to look for. So I didn't want to say like, oh, I don't think before everybody. But this is just the regular scholarship. This is nothing special. I'm saying that, but those two sources are compared. And also how the Shi Ji is seen in context of Herodot and in context of Ibn Khaldun. So
Ibn Khaldun.
There was like two global. I think it's in the Global History Journal. One of the big global history journals had like an article comparing the three. And talking about their approach to others in a certain sense. So just to be a little bit more relative about what I said before.
Do you think that this kind of project then is both possible and necessary, or do you think it doesn't matter?
No.
This is how I ask the question. I mean, I think it's worth thinking about.
You can just take a look if you think that is somehow comparable or not. I'm not sure. It's interpretations of other people. It's not my interpretation. That's what I mean.
I think the problem definitely matters, and I think it matters more than being a response to Malcolm's argument. I think all kinds of efforts in presenting these kinds of texts that hadn't received enough attention is a contribution to the diversity within this tradition. Because the problem that I had with the argument among them is that I felt post-colonial theorists oftentimes treat superpowers as uniform entities, homogeneous within itself. But I feel this piece is just an example of showing the diversity within the tradition, within the so-called superpower.
Within a superpower?
The so-called colonial power. People within the Chinese intellectual tradition debate with each other all the time. And there's no single one dominating rhetoric over the indigenous people, I think.
Also, this it makes me think of another question, which I'm keen to ask based on these materials, right? So we've been asking lots of questions. I've been asking, it's been me asking lots of questions about the representation of otherness, and Patrick was saying this is how it was done in the past. There's other examples of how it was done. I'm wondering if you see in these texts, or in any others that you're aware of, the possibility for hybridity. Is there? So on one level we have this. The one problem with Chen is right is that he sees himself as other to these indigenous peoples. Like he doesn't see any kind of blurring of the boundaries. I think this might have been. I don't know. I'm putting words in her mouth. Maybe behind Mia's question, or at least it made me think about something like Gadamer. In response to you were saying, like, is there a way in which not only we see Chandi looking at the indigenous people, but also the indigenous people looking back at him, like this The shot, reverse shot that Mark was asking about.
I'm borrowing from these
But-
French colleagues.
So that's one way of thinking about it. But then another way is to say, well, the problem is that he still seems to assume that there's a boundary. There's a clearly defined boundary between Han-Chinese and indigenous people. Right? There's not a hybrid, there's no permeable boundary, right? Like boundaries are impermeable, they're clearly defined, they're not transgressed or crossed with any kind of regularity. So that his perception of cultural otherness is still very binary, self-other. There's not like whereas maybe today we would say, well, we live in an age of, because we live in an age of globalization, it's all about permeability and hybridity and transgression and cross-contamination. Those of you in transcultural studies maybe spend a lot of time thinking about this, like how is it that we come to understand, in an age of nationalism, how do we come to understand transnational or non-national or pre-national border crossings? Or indeed, how do we come to understand borders as not really being there at all? And I'm wondering if you see any potential in these texts for having that, for transgressing borders, not just documenting that they exist. It's kind of a weird question because they probably, well, it's weird and it isn't weird. It isn't so weird if you think about the fact, as I mentioned, that Chen had to be talking to somebody who could speak Fujian dialect, Minanhua, like in order to understand, because he certainly wasn't going living around the villages the way we'll see in the next lecture the Dutch missionaries were. So they actually understood the Sarayan language, right? But he didn't. He only spent 10 days on Taiwan. So how was he understanding what was going on? Well, it's because there was a translator there. Well, how did the translator know what was going on? Probably because he had married an indigenous woman who was like some kind of shipwrecked sailor. So we know this was the case when the Dutch first arrived in Taiwan. There was a shipwrecked Portuguese sailor who had married an indigenous person, and that person, that indigenous sailor, happened to know some Dutch, he knew Portuguese, he knew native languages. And so he took these two Dutch, I guess like they were just company representatives, they were low-ranking agents of the Dutch East India Company. He took them to a village, and then they recorded what they had seen. And this is in advance of the Dutch occupation of Taiwan, or the actual building of a fort at Tainan. This was 2 years before that happened. Right, so we know that there are people on the island who are acting as brokers, who are talking about, who are literally translating what's going on in these villages to outsiders. And the villagers themselves know that there's outsiders because, as we know from Zhang Xie's account, so the people in Geelong Dutch were trading with Chinese traders, Japanese traders, etc. And they were even inviting them to dinner, whatever, giving them a feast. But what's funny is none of this, and the same was true of Yunga, like he had all of these, I don't know what they would call them, like these aide-de-camps or something, these people around him who were able to translate indigenous languages and explain what was going on to him, right? Because he too was a newcomer, and he didn't stay long enough to learn languages. So none of that is written into these texts. It's there, it had to be there, that's the possibility, it's the condition of their very possibility of production, but it's not in these texts. So I'm wondering why wouldn't that be the obvious thing to comment on? It's like, oh, there's actually already people here who are living, and they have children, and their children maybe speak more than one language, or maybe the indigenous islanders themselves. He says he knows that they speak not one but many languages, but they can talk to each other sometimes. So they're trading with Chinese, so they had to have some way of talking about things. So wouldn't that be the obvious thing to talk about? And why don't they talk about it? Oh,
No, I have an idea. Probably they go to somebody and say, please bring me to one of the authentic real villages. I want to see the real uncontaminated others. If you have like it's probably even a problem in anthropology that you have this thing where you're like, I need to find the real thing. So,
but how do you get it once you're there? It's already not real because you're there and you're
sure. But still, this might be the reason why it's written like this. He's also only reporting about this, of course, and not about this Creole people that might see even somehow Chinese.
Right. And that also describes a certain kind of other, like it's an example of how he's creating a kind of otherness, right?
And back to your question about the could we reach and kind of with transcultural lens thing, and I just took a look at page 178, the last part of his writing, where he says, since they have come into communication with China, they have developed some desires and rascals with Chen. They have also gradually begun to understand the ways of the world, and I'm afraid their pure simplicity is becoming more and more corrupted. I don't know, but here I see that his understanding of culture is kind of still as an entity. So the Chinese influence the Taiwanese. He describes it as like a one-way process of influence, cultural influence. To me, for me, this part was really interesting. The way he connects China then with the things he sees in Taiwan,
So that the Chinese influence is a corrupting one-way one, but it doesn't. There's no influence on Chinese ways with the Indo-Chinese.
This is the way I read it. I don't know if it's right, but.
No, I think that makes sense. I mean, because this wasn't something that I ever really explored. It's not in the paper that I wrote. But it's obvious. I would get these questions. I present this group, and I get these questions, and people say, "Well, how did he know where to go? Who was he talking to? Did he know these languages?" And I was like, "Oh no, he didn't. He was accompanied by someone, right?" And then that gets me into this larger question, this larger theoretical question about cultural studies. I don't know what you would call it, or the possibility of interculturality, maybe. And that doesn't seem to be present. So in some ways that would be, I think that would actually, something maybe my argument has to deal with, because maybe I'm seeing things in too cut and dry way. But at the same time, maybe we don't want to just reduce his writing to pure rhetoric or something of that nature, right? Out of curiosity, I mean, what about you, our old friend Jenco?
What do you mean? What about him? He looked at the text.
Meanwhile, I'm writing these ideas.
Pretty disgusting.
I mean, is there a way to see him? Is there a way to see him as in a more sympathetic way? Maybe I've been a little too hard for you.
Well.
Or maybe not. I mean, the weird thing though is that Emma Dung seems to think that he's like this great humanitarian, and maybe that would be the result of. Yeah.
But again, I mean, isn't this too presentist? We are now reading these texts and we're finding them extremely racist. I mean, talking about lies and all of these things. But the trouble is that, we are now at a point in time, I think, where there's so much tolerance, though of course there's a lot of intolerance, but there's so much willingness to actually accept other types as part of humanity, which at this point in time, nowhere in the world, people were just thinking this is how it is. And then, anything that deviates. And so,
but that's the interesting part. Like what makes that way of thinking possible? And unfortunately, in the Chinese case, there's a conflation of what happened in the historical past with a cultural essence ascribed to the Chinese, right? Because I suppose in the Chinese entry of modernity as Levinson documents, right? We have this point in time where Chinese history suddenly becomes just historical, or it tells us historical facts, or it becomes part of this cultural essence ascribed to China, right? Like part of the Chinese tradition that is meant to be timeless. So there's this collapsing into, you sort of say at this point in time, people weren't able to think about, they weren't able to have broad tolerance of different ways of thinking. And I agree with you. I actually think that's why Chen is so interesting. because we don't see this anywhere, right? There had to have something had to happen in order to make the conditions of thinking difference possible. And Sankarmutu, as I mentioned, he has one explanation for that. But is it possible in the Chinese case? Because then it becomes very easy to say, not just that they're constrained by the time at which they're writing, but that it was never possible in Chinese discourse to think difference, to think about what difference was. And I just can't accept that. What would be the Chinese way of thinking difference? Or maybe that's the wrong question to ask, but the way that I guess Barbara has phrased the question, it makes me think that its response would too easily fall into, well, when Westerners came and talking about John Stuart Mill and his ideas about free discussion leading us ever closer to the truth, and that's why we have to tolerate different opinions, and that's why we have to value liberal freedom. I mean, why then, on what basis do we value different opinions? Why is it, or different cultural ways of living? What makes that possible? And do we find it in any Chinese texts? Then, maybe I think, these are the conversations I have with myself. Then I think, well, but no, we're being culturally essentialist because we're looking for something in the text that might not be there. Right? But what is in the text? Is what is in the text what I just said is in the text, or is there something else in the text? So I say what I say in the text. What do you think is in the text? I suppose that's my question. Do you understand? Do you understand this convoluted thought process in which I'm engaged? Yeah. So what would be there if not what I'm looking for in it? I guess is my question. And what would you say? Well, no, you're reading it kind of wrong. What's really there is something else. Like this is just, yeah. What would that other thing be? Does that make sense?
The question is how to measure it, right? And so, one of the ways that I would measure it, because I come from literary studies, is by looking at rhetoric. Comparatively. So this was kind of also your suggestion. Or, just other texts of the same time, which you're doing. But they are writing very differently, these guys.
Yeah. They are. I mean, so one way to look, that's a perfectly legitimate way. Like lots of people in literature have looked, literature is one way of sort of thinking about it in terms of literary genre or something like that, right? Which I've been reading a bit more about. I'm not literature, I'm reading a bit more about because I'm engaging the Ming, and the Ming is so literary in all of its production, its textual production. But then I think, this is okay. This is where I'm really showing my true colors again. Is it just the case that when we study Chinese discourse, we study rhetoric, but when we study European, we're actually reading it for some kind of truth about how to think difference or how to do something realistic in the world, right? And I don't want to just say there's just one set of texts that help us think about political problems or think about cultural difference or whatever. And that everybody else just has rhetoric, right? Or everybody else has history, or they have, but really only Euro-American discourse has normatively defensible insights about the human condition or about political life or about cultural difference. Do you see my problem? This is why I think in some ways I'm kind of like hard-headed, because people are always like, if I were to just do Chinese studies, I think it would be a lot easier. I could say a lot more. I would just be more descriptive. I could probably say things that people would find less controversial and more enlightening. But I kind of force this, not because I think I'm reading something into the text, but because I want to say, well, no, there has to be a possibility, and I think I found it in Shendi. Not that I went looking for it, mind you. I just found that it found me. Of understanding, how would you understand difference in a way that is not imperial, in a way that doesn't erase it. And I think Shendi has this really unusual solution that I haven't seen anywhere else, where we think about parallel historical timelines. What is that?
It's so.
That's the second second or third weird sound. Maybe it's the power of my mind doing that. It's just like I'm exploding with all these ideas. It's starting to affect the acoustics.
I totally sympathize with your points of departure and the pressure that you feel from the colleagues, because I think within critical theory, there's just so few people who understand the Chinese primary text to be able to say anything meaningful about them. So I think you already know more about the Chinese literature than they do, and I think we should just worry less about the challenges they pose sometimes. I think we should step back and try to see whether that's a legitimate question.
Yeah.
For example, sometimes I think the post-colonial theorists in our field, they are really paradoxical. So on one hand, they want to stress the distinctness of each culture.
Yeah.
But they also want to deny that the boundary exists between these cultures.
Yeah.
I just think sometimes the questions they pose are not legitimate questions, and we don't have to address them in theory. I think the work you do is meaningful by itself.
It's very kind of you.
Trying to recover a hidden or a text that has been forgotten, I think is meaningful. So even if it's not a response to a certain article that has been recently published, I think the question that you're addressing are correct questions.
Yeah, but it's quite difficult, I found, to sort of bridge this, what I'm doing here, with a more ambitious claim to say that it has something to say that's meaningful. Like, that it has something to say that's meaningful to more than just people interested in Chinese texts.
Right.
Or more than, it's of more value than to just Chinese audiences. You know, because this can come off as saying, oh, that's very interesting, that's the way the Chinese do things. But it doesn't really tell us anything about colonial discourse, or about the nature of difference, or about how we can think about other cultures, like, or about the representation of others. It doesn't really tell us about those things. It's just the way Chinese do things. It's like this evidence of their particularity, but it doesn't actually contribute to a broader conversation. So getting it to say something to that broader conversation, that's really my life's work, I guess, is all, like, throughout all of my work. There's this hidden question about how do we make it legitimate? Like, how do we actually make it part of global discourse and not just part of Chinese studies?
But do we really have to address the post-colonial concerns to be part of the broader conversation? I don't think we need to.
Oh, I see what you mean. So yours more, you're saying something more about the specific question I'm raising. But I guess part of what I'm interested in, I mean, the Qing did have a colonial, a quasi-colonial something. They extended territorial jurisdiction over Taiwan, and they came up with a wide range of reasons for why that was possible. And a lot of those reasons had to do with the way in which indigenous others were represented. Right? So that there's a close relationship between those. And we've seen that in other places. We've seen that post-colonial discourse has drawn attention to, post-colonial scholarship has drawn attention for us to that phenomenon in other places, right? But then the question is, okay, well, then what is how are these discourses different in the Chinese case? And can we say that they're different, not just observe that they're different and then set it aside? Or do we want to say that they're saying something interesting and meaningful that can speak to broader, can be generalized a bit, I guess?
So that goes to your question about anti-imperialism? Or that goes back to the question about anti-imperial, and can we use that vocabulary?
About what I'm saying?
Anti-imperial.
Oh, anti-imperial, yes. So
because,
it does.
okay, so can I ask you a question? Because it really touches upon some of the things that you are also writing about theoretically, right?
Yeah.
And I would like to know do we know anything about the reader who suggested that anti-imperial shouldn't be used? And is it because that reader feels that it's diffusing rather than making it concrete, which is really what you want to do? Mm-hmm. Or why are they saying
So they were basically saying that there's no, kind of like what Mikhail was saying, like what was his role there? His role was not an imperial role. He was not a Qing administrator or a Ming administrator. He was just going there in the entourage of this general. He was actually a military, we call him like a military attaché. He was giving them advice about strategy. And that's why he went there. So he didn't have any designs on the actual colonial
so it's just a
annexation of Taiwan. Mm-hmm. So they said, well, but then is it really imperial? Like, how do you fit it within a discourse that was obviously not meant to contribute to?
Right.
Intentionally, it was not his intention to contribute to it. And one thing I say is, well, I'm arguing against a scholarship that has situated him within this discourse. That is why. And then his argument in effect is anti-imperial because it shows us a way in which we can represent difference that does not justify the extension of imperial rule over this set of others. Right?
Yeah.
That was my, well, that was my original justification, but then I guess they didn't get it.
Yeah, they definitely didn't get it.
Why would it be anti-imperial, right? And it's a bit related to this presentist question, right? Like that it's my question that I'm imposing on him because he didn't care about imperialism or colonialism. He wasn't involved in that project at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like you can't really say
their criticism is going in that direction. Their criticism is more functional. It doesn't go in the direction of, should we be using these kinds of terms? Because actually China is more specific in these terms would be.
Yeah.
Or can we generalize? I mean, that was
right. I think
that was how you
so
ended up.
they were historians and they read the text from historical and they said that you're overreaching. I guess you're overreaching. Right? But I would see what I'm doing as constitutive of political theorizing.
Yeah.
But then defending that every single time you write an article, it gets kind of tiresome. So the question is, if I publish in history journals, I just accept their standards and sort of say, okay, I'm doing history. If I'm publishing in political theory, then the problem is though that you tend to get slammed either way, right? Like you get
It's the in between.
Mia, can I just ask, you actually seem to understand me when I was talking about this. So I was just curious, like where you're coming to this material from, and if you found if you found it helpful for what you're working on.
You mean
Yeah.
what material?
The Chen, and the general idea of like representing cultural evidence. I'm just curious if you have, it's obviously fine, but
yeah. So I'm actually also thinking a lot about the question: how could we more communicate? It sounds big, but how could we more communicate to the world that Chinese traditional philosophy, for instance, matters to a universal? Kind of contributes to universal knowledge. And I did a project last year with a professor from Taiwan University where I studied my bachelor, and we tried to develop, by looking at traditional Chinese philosophy and Japanese philosophy, try to develop a new understanding for film. Because film theory is also very Western centric. Like we always use Western thinkers for understanding film studies, but they rejected our project. We tried to apply for a grant, but we didn't get it in the end. And why I found Chen's text interesting is that his way of looking at Taiwan and the other is very. I thought about it from a transcultural perspective, and I think it's very interesting. And so I totally do see your point, and I'm also trying to understand how can we make Chinese philosophy
generalizable or something. I think that's my word.
Last week I went to a talk about the Silk Road. It was from the Heidelberger Kreis.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't last week, but some weeks ago.
Yeah.
And it's like this group of students from different kind of fields, and they were talking about different topics, and they were really angrily talking about China, and they don't understand their political system. Why are they doing things like that? And I wanted to ask, is it helpful for you to think in this way, like being so emotional about it? Maybe we could first step back and ask, what are you doing? Understanding why the Chinese political system is like that, and then judging maybe. But for me, it's always people are quick in judging.
Especially
about
nowadays.
China, And also with the transcultural perspective, I think for us here as students, it makes total sense. But when I try to explain it to my friends, they don't understand why it matters that we think about cultures and a mutual exchange process.
Really?
Yeah. They say, but take a look at our maps. We have the Chinese culture because it has there's not all of my friends, but some don't understand. thinking about how is it possible to communicate this like different understanding of the other.
Yeah.
Because we are always connecting it like with borders because we have this like maps in our mind, I think.
Yeah, well, I think because of nationalism, I think that's a big influence, right? Where we believe that maps, the borders of maps somehow also border the cultures that assign to them. But it seems, I mean, based on the questions I was asking, that just sort of occurred to me as we were having this discussion about like, well, where were the transcultural transgressions or contaminations or hybridizations in these accounts in Chen you don't know, and they're not there. I mean, so it's not just it's not just a nationalism, it's not just nationalism, modern nationalism that gives us these borders, but there's also a sense of maybe, I guess civilization. But at the same time, if it was just civilization, and all you would have in Chinese accounts would be an account of like how far from Chinese civilization other places were. The fact that they could exist in totally different ways and modes indicates something about the fact that there were varieties of barbarians, that there were different ways of living, and that these could be set alongside each other, I guess. It's quite interesting now. Now that I'm thinking about it, on what basis are they actually? So I think somebody like you is definitely setting the indigenous people in a line, right? And saying, well, they're just like primitive, they're far from where we are in time, right? And they're just on their way to becoming us. But I don't think Chendi or even some of these other accounts necessarily do just that. And I think there is some indication that they're sort of saying, especially John Shea, which we didn't read, but he just sort of he like takes all this information and just gives it all. Some of it's not quite organized, it's just sort of every which way, but the very fact that he can sort of say there's all these different ways of living, and they're kind of weird, but they're interesting, and he doesn't say anything about the fact that they should be civilized or they should be brought into the Confucian orbit. He's just documenting them for the sake of documenting them. It says a lot about the possibilities. I mean, it says that there is some possibility in that local way, that there is a way of thinking about difference legitimately. But that just occurred to me. It's not an argument that I make.
And then I think when we take a look at Chendi, seeing of how he thinks about the cultural other, it takes us then, as we just said, also back to Zhuangzi or like other traditional Chinese thinkers. So the map always expands by like taking a look at one writer and then connecting it to other traditional Chinese thinkers. That's also really interesting. It gets us like deeper into why does the maybe I don't know if I can call it the Chinese way of thinking about difference, but why does it matter?
Yeah. You're asking me why does it matter?
Or no, but I think it matters because as we can see when we like take a look at how Chendi writes, we also can read Zhuangzi in Chinese writing, and it shows us that there are a lot of important ideas of how to think about the other in traditional Chinese thought.
Right. And then there's something, but then why does it matter? That's the question I ask myself. Is it just to say, oh, actually the Chinese are more diverse than we said? Or does it say something about, oh, well, now we have a wider variety of methodologies for thinking about otherness? That would be an interesting conclusion in my opinion, because I think that's part of it. That they're defensible and feasible and can be used in different contexts. I think that would be interesting. Or are we just saying, well, we're trying to, and this is something my students who take classes with me, I start off by saying, I'm not going to give you the information that will make you rich in China, because they all are, they're studying finance or whatever, they want to go off and I'm like, don't take this course because you think I'm going to unlock the secrets of the Orient for you, because that's not what I'm doing. But there is an obvious application here to, for example, present day Chinese PRC attempts at One Belt One Road. I mean, they're making huge inroads into Africa and South Asia, Pakistan, places like that, in ways that seem somewhat colonial. I mean, are there connections between these past discourses or justifications and present day ones? I would imagine that there would be, but I don't want to just say I'm researching this so that I can find out what the Chinese are up to in the present day, because I think that's too reductive. But it's a possible application that would make it more broad.